Hey everyone, tonight we are going deep, deeper than you've probably ever been, into a world that feels both impossibly ancient and alarmingly alive. Imagine a blanket of humidity so thick you can almost drink the air, and the light, when it breaks through the canopy 100 feet above, dapples the forest floor in a shifting, hypnotic mosaic. This is the Amazon, the world's lung, a place so vast and dense that it has guarded its greatest secrets for centuries. It's a place where you are never, ever at the top of the food chain, and frankly, a place where your fancy hiking gear and well-intentioned water filter mean you'd probably last about a day and a half. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see our little community scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is the first thing you truly notice. It's not just air, it's a substance. Heavy, wet, and smelling of damp earth, sweet rot, and 1,000 kinds of unseen blossoms. You feel it pressing on your skin, a constant warm embrace that has your shirt soaked with sweat within minutes. Sweat, you realize, has just become your body's primary state of being. You trudge forward, your boots sinking slightly into the soft, mulch-like ground. Above you, the canopy is a dense, interlocking puzzle of leaves, vines, and branches. A ceiling so complete that you can barely guess the time of day. It's a green cathedral, and the sounds that echo through it are its choir. A startling shriek from a hidden bird, the low, guttural growl of a howler monkey in the distance, and always, the ceaseless, high-pitched thrum of insects. It's a wall of sound, so constant that when it occasionally dips into silence, the quiet itself feels loud and threatening. You push a massive, waxy leaf out of your path and continue on. The path itself is a generous term for the barely there trail you're following. Everything grows here with a kind of reckless abandon. What was a clear space yesterday could be reclaimed by vines and saplings tomorrow. This, you think, is the wilderness everyone talks about. The pristine, untouched jungle. The world as it was before humans started paving things over and building artisanal coffee shops. For centuries, this was the dominant view of the Amazon. A great green void on the map, inhabited only by small, scattered tribes of hunter-gatherers, living lightly on the land, dwarfed by the sheer, unconquerable power of nature. When the first European explorers, like the Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana in 1541, traveled down the Amazon River, they came back with wild tales. They spoke of vast cities, dense populations lining the riverbanks for miles, and organized societies. But these accounts were quickly dismissed back in Europe. They were chalked up to exaggeration, fever dreams brought on by the jungle itself. The men who followed found little evidence to support these claims, and so the myth of the empty, virgin wilderness was born and solidified. It was easier to believe it was empty. It made it easier to exploit. You pause to wipe your brow, leaning against a colossal tree whose roots are like buttresses on a Gothic cathedral. The insect chorus seems to have found a new rhythm, and you can't help but feel you're being watched. You probably are. By thousands of things. You might see a line of leafcutter ants marching with military precision, each carrying a piece of greenery like a tiny sail. But for every creature you see, there are a million you don't. There are ants, for example, a species known as Colobopsis saundersi, whose soldiers, when threatened by a predator, can intentionally rupture a gland in their body, releasing a sticky, toxic goo to trap and kill the enemy. They literally explode for the good of the colony. It is a sobering reminder that nature's definition of team player can be a little more intense than what you're used to at the office. This overwhelming sense of nature's dominance is why, for so long, the academic world held on to the idea of environmental determinism for the Amazon. The logic was simple. The soil is too poor, the challenge is too great for large, complex societies to have ever taken root here. Historians still argue whether the total pre-Columbian population of the Amazon basin was a meager 2 million or a staggering 20 million. The evidence was just too buried, too consumed by the jungle to settle the debate. The rainforest, it seemed, was the ultimate winner. A green tide that erases all human endeavor. Your GPS, by the way, has been useless for hours. displaying a single, mocking dot in a sea of undifferentiated green. It seems the jungle eats satellite signals for breakfast. So you press on, resigned to the idea that you are just a temporary guest in a world that doesn't care about you one bit. You are walking through a history that has no buildings, no monuments, no roads, just trees, vines, mud, and the ghosts of Orellana's fever dreams. But then, something feels wrong. Or rather, not wrong, just different. You stumble over a root, catching yourself on a vine, and as you look down to curse at the ground, you notice it. The ground here, beneath the layer of leaf litter, isn't undulating and random like everything else. It's raised, and it's running in a perfectly straight line, disappearing into the thick undergrowth in both directions. You follow it with your eyes, then take a few steps along its edge. It's unmistakable, it's a feature. An unnaturally straight, wide ridge, maybe a meter high. It's subtle, easily missed, but now that you see it, you can't unsee it. In this chaotic, sprawling, organic world, you've just found a straight line. And straight lines are not something the jungle typically makes on its own. That straight line feels alien in your hand. You crouch down, brushing away the dead leaves and loose soil. It's not a rock formation. It's compacted earth, intentionally mounded and shaped. You stand up and look along its length again. It runs as true as a Roman road, a ruler's straight feature in a world that abhors a right angle. For a moment, you wonder if it's a trick of the mind, an illusion created by the dappled light and the disorienting green. But it's solid beneath your feet. It's real. And the question that immediately floods your mind is as simple as it is profound. What is this doing here? To truly understand what you've stumbled upon, though, you have to get above it all. You have to climb, leaving the humid, claustrophobic forest floor far below, and see this world from the perspective of a hawk or a god. So imagine yourself rising, up through the layers of the canopy, past the curious monkeys and the brilliantly colored macaws. You burst through the top layer of leaves into the bright, unfiltered sunlight, and you keep climbing, 100 feet, 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet. From this vantage point, the Amazon is no longer a confusing tangle of individual trees and vines. It's a vast, textured carpet of green, stretching to every horizon. It looks exactly like the pristine wilderness you imagined, at first. But you know there's a secret down there. You know about the straight line. So you keep looking, and as your eyes adjust, you start to see them. Faint, subtle, but undeniably there. The patterns. It started with pilots in the early 20th century, flying over these remote regions. They'd glance down and see strange shadows and shapes on the ground, especially during the dry season or in areas where the forest was thinner. They reported seeing vast geometric forms, perfect circles, squares, and long, straight avenues carved into the earth. It was easy to dismiss, a trick of the light, natural formations. Or maybe the pilots had just spent a little too much time at high altitude. But the sightings kept coming. Then came satellite imagery. And suddenly the sheer, mind-boggling scale of it all became undeniable. What you found on the ground wasn't an isolated feature. It was one tiny thread in a colossal interconnected tapestry of human engineering that covers thousands of square miles. From the air, you can see them clearly now. There are massive square-shaped moats. There are circular ditches so geometrically precise they look like they were drawn with a compass. In a nearby region of Brazil, the state of Acre, hundreds of these geoglyphs have been found, often revealed by modern deforestation. Archaeologists still debate whether their primary purpose was for defense, for ceremonies, or for some form of ancient resource management. Some of them are truly bizarre, consisting of concentric circles connected by straight paths, almost like a circuit board printed onto the earth. Of course, when these were first gaining public attention, the fringe theories came out to play. Alien landing strips, portals to another dimension, you name it. It is always more exciting to imagine ancient astronauts than ancient engineers with a really good understanding of geometry. The sheer precision is what's so staggering. These weren't just ditches dug haphazardly. They were planned. You see long, raised causeways like the one you were standing on, connecting various points sometimes for miles. They cut straight through swamps and seasonally flooded grasslands, elevated highways for a people who lived in a world of water. You see canals, reservoirs, and huge artificial mounds, often arranged in deliberate, meaningful patterns. It's a landscape that has been thoroughly, systematically, and intelligently altered. This is a concept that's familiar to us from other parts of the world. Think of the famous Nazca lines in the deserts of Peru. Those giant geoglyphs of hummingbirds, spiders, and monkeys are only truly visible from the air. For a long time, they were a profound mystery. We now know they were created by the Nazca culture between 500 BCE and 500 CE. While their exact purpose is still debated, they prove that ancient peoples in South America were more than capable of creating landscape-scale art and engineering. But this is different. The Nazca lines are drawings on the landscape. What you're seeing below you is the landscape itself, redesigned and re-engineered. It begs the question of how. How did they achieve such precision without modern surveying tools, without the ability to fly above their work to check the progress? It is a bit like trying to draw a perfect circle the size of a football stadium while standing in the middle of it with a blindfold on. The people who built these must have had a sophisticated system of measurement and planning that we are only just beginning to appreciate. They couldn't pop up in a Cessna to see how their giant square was coming along, unless they had some really, really tall friends to stand on each other's shoulders. What you are witnessing is the ghost of a civilization, a blueprint of their world etched into the very soil, and then patiently hidden by the forest for centuries, waiting for a new kind of eye to see it from the sky. The straight line you found on the ground is no longer a mystery, it's a clue. It's a single sentence in a sprawling epic written across the earth. From up here you can see that your line connects to another, which leads to a large, rectangular platform mound, which is in turn surrounded by a system of zigzagging earthen walls. It's not random. It's a system, a vast interconnected network of structures that speaks of a society with a deep understanding of its environment, a large and organized workforce, and a vision that spanned generations. The illusion of the untouched wilderness, the green hell that supposedly consumes all human endeavor, shatters completely. The jungle didn't erase them. The jungle grew over them. It became a shroud, hiding one of the greatest works of landscape engineering in the ancient world. And it's here, in this specific corner of the Amazon, that the story gets truly interesting. So let's put a name to this incredible place you're hovering over. You are not just in some random patch of the Amazon. Your journey has brought you to a very specific and very strange landscape in northeastern Bolivia. It's a vast, flat plain of around 70,000 square miles known as the Llanos de Moxos, or the Mojos Plains. And the first thing you need to understand about this place is that it's not the jungle you see in movies. It's not a uniform, triple canopy rainforest. Instead, it's a mosaic, a sprawling tropical savanna dotted with patches of dense forest, winding rivers, and grasslands that stretch to the horizon. It's a place of dramatic, almost violent extremes. The local climate basically has two settings: biblical flood and forgot to water the lawn. For about half the year, during the rainy season, rivers flowing down from the Andes overflow their banks and inundate the entire region. The Llanos de Moxos transforms into a great, shallow inland sea, a shimmering sheet of water where the only dry land is found in those elevated forest patches. Then, for the other half of the year, the sun beats down, the water recedes, and the land can become parched and cracked. Living here for any species means adapting to this profound annual cycle of flood and drought. For humans, it presents a monumental challenge. How do you farm when your fields are underwater for 6 months? How do you travel when the entire world becomes a swamp? How do you build a lasting, stable society in a landscape that completely reinvents itself every single year? The conventional answer for a long time was that you don't. You couldn't. This was considered a marginal environment, capable of supporting only small mobile groups of people. But what those satellites and aerial surveys revealed is that someone didn't get the memo. Someone or some group of people looked at this seemingly impossible landscape and didn't see an obstacle. They saw an opportunity. They saw an engine powered by the annual flood that they could harness. And the evidence of their work is staggering. We're not talking about a few dozen mounds or a couple of strange ditches. The scale of the earthworks in the Llanos de Moxos is almost impossible to convey. Archaeologists have so far mapped over 20,000 distinct structures. These include thousands of artificial mounds, hundreds of miles of raised causeways and canals, and vast zigzagging fish weirs. The total area transformed by these ancient engineers is estimated to be larger than the entire country of Switzerland. It's so vast, in fact, that it was effectively invisible to those living right on top of it for centuries. When Spanish Jesuit missionaries arrived here in the late 17th century to establish their famous missions, they lived among the descendants of these great earth movers. They meticulously documented the local languages, customs, and environment. And yet, their extensive writings contain almost no mention of the colossal ancient infrastructure they were literally walking on every day. They saw the mounds and causeways, of course, but they seem to have considered them natural features of the landscape, or perhaps the recent work of the local tribes. It is perhaps the ultimate case of not being able to see the forest for the trees, or in this case, not seeing the 10,000 square miles of sophisticated civil engineering for the very nice palm trees growing on top of it. Scholars are still trying to piece together the exact chronology of this grand project. Was it the work of a single powerful state that mobilized a massive population over a few hundred years of intense construction? Or was it a more organic process, with different communities gradually adding to and modifying the landscape over 1,000 years or more? Trying to date mounds of dirt is notoriously difficult. They aren't very talkative and they don't carry ID. But current estimates suggest that this construction began as early as 1000 BCE, and that the society behind it reached its peak between about 500 and 1400 CE, centuries before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The local indigenous people, like the Siriono, have myths that seem to echo this lost world. Some of their oral traditions speak of a powerful ancestor hero, a great builder who raised the land and controlled the waters. It's tempting to see this not just as a myth, but as a kind of cultural memory, a story passed down through countless generations about the master engineers who first tamed this floodplain. What you are looking at is, without exaggeration, one of the planet's great forgotten archaeological wonders. It's a testament to human ingenuity on par with the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia or the rice terraces of Southeast Asia. Yet, it remains largely unknown to the outside world. There are no towering stone pyramids here, no golden treasures to attract legions of tourists and documentary crews. The monuments of the Llanos de Moxos are more subtle. They are made of earth, water, and an intimate understanding of the rhythms of the natural world. They are monuments not to gods or kings, but to sustainability, to community, and to the profound idea that you can shape your world without destroying it. So, you've arrived in this incredible engineered land. You know its scale is immense. The next question is, what are these structures really? What was the purpose of these thousands of mounds, these endless causeways and canals? It's time to get a closer look at the different components of this ancient environmental machine. All right, let's get our hands dirty, metaphorically speaking. You're floating above the Llanos de Moxos, this vast, re-engineered landscape, and it's time to zoom in on the individual pieces of this enormous environmental puzzle. Because this isn't just a random collection of mounds and ditches, it's an integrated system, a machine made of earth and water. Each component had a specific job to do. So, let's take a closer look at the four main types of structures that define this region. First, you have the mounds. The locals call them lomas. From the air, they look like dark green islands of forest floating in a sea of golden brown savanna grass. And that's exactly what they are, artificial islands. During the great annual flood, these mounds are the only things that stay high and dry. They were the sites of villages and homes, agricultural fields and sacred spaces. Some are small, just big enough for a single extended family. Others are enormous, covering dozens of acres and rising 30 feet or more above the plain, clearly the centers of larger communities. They were built painstakingly, one basketful of earth at a time over centuries. What's fascinating is what they're made of. When archaeologists excavate these mounds, they don't just find dirt, they find a rich, black, incredibly fertile soil, packed with broken pottery, animal bones, charcoal, and other organic waste. It seems these mounds were built up over generations with the accumulated refuse of daily life. Living on top of centuries of your ancestors' leftovers might not sound glamorous, but it created an elevated, flood-proof, and self-fertilizing platform for farming. It beats having a waterlogged living room 6 months of the year. Next, you have the causeways or calzadas. These are the straight lines you first saw from the air, and they are perhaps the most visually impressive feature. They are long, raised earthen roads, some running dead straight for miles across the landscape. They connect mounds to other mounds and settlements to resource areas. When the entire region was a shallow lake, these causeways were the vital transportation network. They allowed people to walk between communities, to visit relatives, to trade goods, and to access hunting grounds, all while staying dry. Think of the famous Roman road system, a monumental feat of engineering designed to connect a vast empire. These causeways served a similar purpose, an all-weather highway system for a wetland world. But without the potholes and the terrible gas station coffee. But they were more than just roads. They also acted as dikes and levees, giving their builders a remarkable degree of control over the movement of water across the floodplain. A strategically placed causeway could hold back floodwater from an agricultural area or channel it towards a reservoir. This brings us to the third type of structure, the canals and reservoirs. If the causeways were the highways, the canals were the waterways. You can see them from above as thin, dark lines, often running parallel to the causeways or branching off to connect rivers and lakes. These were not natural creeks. They were excavated channels, dug to facilitate travel by canoe and to manage water. And alongside them, you find reservoirs, large excavated depressions, some covering several acres, designed to store the abundant wet season water for use during the long, punishing dry season. There is still some discussion about whether the canals were primarily for transportation or for large-scale irrigation of crops. The truth is, they were likely multi-purpose, their function shifting with the seasons. In the wet season, a primary canoe route. In the dry season, a vital source of water for thirsty fields of maize, manioc, and squash planted on the flanks of the mounds. So you have high ground for living, roads for walking, and canals for paddling. It's a complete and logical system for conquering this challenging environment. But then you see the fourth type of structure, and things get weird. Scattered across huge areas of the wetlands, you see vast networks of low earthen walls, usually only a foot or two high. Unlike the straight causeways, these walls are often arranged in distinctive zigzag or V-shaped patterns. Thousands of them, covering huge swathes of the landscape. From the air, they can look like a strange, geometric rash on the land, or the frantic scribbling of a giant. Nature loves fractals and curves, but it rarely produces thousands of identical, sharp-angled zigzags. These are clearly man-made, but for what? They're too low for defense. They don't seem to be delineating fields in any conventional sense. They don't connect major settlements like the causeways do. For decades, they were the biggest enigma of the Llanos de Moxos. These strange angular earthworks are the key. Understanding their purpose is what finally unlocks the true genius of this entire civilization. It's the final piece of the puzzle that, once slotted into place, transforms your perception of this society from one that was simply surviving the floods to one that was actively harnessing them for a purpose so audacious and on such a massive scale that it has no known parallel in the ancient Americas. You've seen their homes, their roads, and their water tanks. Now it's time to understand their engine, the primary source of the wealth and stability that allowed this incredible society to flourish for over 1,000 years. It's all hidden in the function of those strange zigzagging walls. So you are hovering there, looking down at those thousands of strange zigzagging patterns etched into the earth. They are the great enigma, the piece of this ancient puzzle that just doesn't seem to fit with the rest. The mounds are for living, the causeways are for walking, the canals are for travel and water storage. It all makes perfect sense. But these V-shaped walls, they're too low for defense, too oddly shaped for property lines, too numerous for simple irrigation channels. To understand them, you have to stop thinking about the dry land you see during half the year and start thinking about the water. You have to imagine the moment of transition when the rains begin to fall and the great flood arrives. Picture it. The sky darkens and the first rains come, turning the dusty plains into thick mud. Then the rivers, swollen with water from the distant Andes, begin to break their banks. A sheet of shallow, slow-moving water starts to creep across the landscape, rising steadily for weeks. It submerges the grasslands, fills the canals, and laps at the base of the causeways and the great settlement mounds. The whole world becomes a lake. But this flood is not a sterile, destructive force. It's the pulse of life. As the floodwaters spread out from the main river channels, they carry with them an explosion of life. And most importantly, they carry fish. Tens of millions of them. They swim out of the deep river channels and onto the newly inundated floodplain, which has become a massive temporary dining room, rich with snails, insects, and submerged vegetation. For the fish, this is the season of feasting and spawning. It must have been the greatest party of the year. The ancient people of the Llanos de Moxos watched this happen, year after year, century after century. They saw this massive, predictable migration of protein swim right up to their doorsteps. And at some point, a genius idea was born. What if, instead of just hoping to catch some of these fish with a net or a hook, they could harvest them? What if they could use the land itself to catch the fish for them? And that is the secret of the zigzag walls. They are fish weirs. Here's how it works. The fish have their months-long party on the flooded plains. Then, as the rainy season ends, the water begins to recede. It doesn't just vanish. It slowly flows back towards the main river channels. And as the fish follow the receding water, they encounter the weirs. The low V-shaped walls now just below the surface act as giant funnels. The fish swimming with the current are gently guided along the arms of the V towards the point. At that point, the ancient builders would have placed a trap, perhaps a woven basket, a net, or a small corral. The fish, concentrated by the weir, would pour directly into the trap. It's an incredibly elegant, passive system. You don't chase the fish. You let the landscape and the natural rhythm of the flood bring the fish to you. This was basically the world's first and largest food delivery service. The floodwaters bring the food to you. You just have to be there to sign for the package. This is the fish weir hypothesis, and it revolutionizes our understanding of this entire society. This wasn't just a culture that was good at surviving floods. This was a civilization fueled by fish. This technology is not entirely unique to the Amazon, of course. Humans all over the world have independently invented fish weirs. You can find the remains of ancient stone weirs on the coasts of Ireland, and the estuaries of England, and the indigenous peoples of North America as Pacific Northwest built incredibly complex wooden weirs in their rivers. But what is utterly unprecedented here is the scale. Thousands of weirs, integrated with canals and reservoirs, spread across an area the size of a small country. This was aquaculture on an industrial level. Anthropologists continue to explore the extent to which this massive fish harvest was their primary food source, versus a supplement to the maize and manioc they grew on their island mounds. But the sheer size of the infrastructure suggests that fish were not just a side dish. They were the foundation of the entire economy. Some researchers have run the numbers, and the potential yield is mind-boggling. This system could have produced thousands of tons of fish each year, easily supporting a large, dense, and sedentary population. The very kind of population that was thought to be impossible in the Amazon. One of the likely star players in this ancient industry was a fish called the pacu, a large cousin of the piranha. But unlike its toothy relative, the pacu is largely a fruit and nut eater, a gentle giant of the river. You can just imagine them, feasting on submerged fruit trees during the flood, getting fat and happy, before the water recedes and guides them into the traps. It's the ultimate get-rich-quick scheme if your definition of rich is more smoked, salted, and dried fish than you can possibly imagine. The excess catch could be preserved and stored, providing a reliable source of protein year-round, buffering the society against bad harvests or poor hunting. It could also be traded, forming the basis of their economic power. So the great mystery is solved. The zigzag walls were the engines of a massive food production system. This explains how such a complex society could flourish here. It explains the need for the mounds to live on, the causeways to travel and manage the system, and the reservoirs to hold water. All the pieces now fit together, and it all hinges on this brilliantly simple yet incredibly sophisticated method of turning the annual flood from a liability into the greatest asset imaginable. Which of course leads to the next big question. How did they actually do it? How do you go about building thousands of precisely angled earthen walls in the middle of a swampy floodplain? So how do you do it? How do you build a fish-catching machine the size of a modern county using nothing but dirt, sticks, and teamwork? Let's roll up your sleeves, because you're about to join the construction crew. The first thing you need to forget is the idea of blueprints and laser levels. The genius of this system lies in its intimate relationship with the land itself. It's a low-tech, high-knowledge endeavor. Your first job as an apprentice weir builder isn't to dig, it's to watch, to learn. You'd spend years observing the landscape, especially during that critical time when the floodwaters are receding. You'd learn to read the land, to see the almost imperceptible dips and rises in the terrain that are invisible to an untrained eye. You'd learn how the water flows, where it moves fastest, where it pools, and which paths it prefers on its journey back to the river. This intimate, generational knowledge is everything. They were basically practicing fluid dynamics without any of the fancy computer models. Their models were generations of their grandparents pointing at a patch of dirt and saying, "No, you idiot, a little more to the left." This deep understanding, what some might call landscape memory, allowed them to place their weirs in the most optimal locations, maximizing the catch for the minimum amount of effort. Once a location is chosen, the real work begins, and it's all about timing. All major construction has to happen during the dry season, when the ground is firm and accessible. This would have been a period of intense communal activity. Imagine the scene. The sun is hot, the air is buzzing with insects, and hundreds of people are out on the plain. This isn't the work of a few individuals, it's a society-wide effort. It's the original community project, though I imagine there were fewer bake sales and a whole lot more mud and sweating. This is where social organization becomes critical. Researchers disagree on the level of social stratification required to pull this off. Did you need a powerful chief or a priestly class directing the labor, a bit like the pharaohs of Egypt with their pyramids? Or could this have been a more cooperative effort, managed by village elders and family groups working together for the common good? It's possible both models existed at different times or in different parts of the region. Regardless of who was in charge, the building process itself was straightforward and brutally effective. Your toolkit is simple: a sharpened digging stick to break up the soil, maybe a stone-bladed hoe and a woven basket. That's about it. Their entire engineering marvel was built with little more than sticks, stones, and a whole lot of community spirit. Oh, and baskets. You really can't underestimate the power of a good sturdy basket. You and your fellow workers would dig up the tough savanna sod and clay from an area right next to your planned weir. This act of digging conveniently creates a shallow channel or pond, which itself can become part of the water management system. Then, the real labor begins, moving the earth. You'd form a human chain, passing basket after basket of heavy, damp soil to the builders, who would dump it and stamp it down with their feet, slowly building up the low wall of the weir. It's methodical, rhythmic, back-breaking work under the tropical sun. The walls themselves didn't need to be very high, remember? Often just a foot or two was enough to influence the flow of the shallow floodwater and guide the fish. The key was the angle of the V, pointing downstream, to create that perfect funnel. This type of massive, organized labor is something historians see in many ancient societies. It's often called corvée labor, where people owe a certain number of days of work to the community or the state for public projects. Whether it was for building the Great Wall of China, maintaining Inca roads, or constructing fish weirs in Bolivia, it was the engine that powered the ancient world. And this wasn't a one-and-done job. These were earthen structures in a dynamic, watery landscape. They required constant maintenance. Every dry season, the community would have to come out to repair sections that had been eroded by the last flood, clear out silt and vegetation, and perhaps even modify or add new sections to the system. It was a yearly commitment, a recurring contract between the people and their environment. So you have this incredible system, built with simple tools and immense local knowledge, powered by a highly organized community. They weren't just moving dirt, they were sculpting their world, creating a food production landscape of breathtaking scale and efficiency. You stand back, wiping sweat from your brow, and look at the newly completed weir. It's just a low ridge of earth, a simple V shape on the vast, flat plain. It seems almost insignificant. But you know that in a few months, when the rains return and the world is transformed, this simple line of dirt will become part of a powerful machine, passively harvesting the bounty of the flood and feeding thousands of people. And as you look around, you see the other components of this society: the causeways connecting the mounds, the smoke rising from the villages on their high ground. It becomes clear that the engineering of the land and the engineering of their society were one and the same. You can't have one without the other. Which leads you to wonder, what kind of society was it? What was life actually like for the people who built and lived in this watery world? It's one thing to stand back and admire a grand piece of engineering. It's another to ask who. Who were the minds that conceived of this? Who were the hands that built it? For a long time, the answer was a shrug. But decades of patient archaeological work have given us a name. We call them the Kasarabe culture, a name taken from a small town in the region. We have to be honest here. We have no idea what they called themselves. It's a bit like future archaeologists digging up the ruins of New York City and calling its inhabitants the hot dog stand people because they found a lot of old carts. But Kasarabe is the label we use for the archaeological signature of this remarkable society that flourished here, from roughly 500 CE to 1400 CE. To understand how their society likely worked, you have to appreciate that their entire world was organized around the control of water. This has led archaeologists to describe them as a hydraulic society. This is a powerful concept, most famously developed by the historian Carl Wittfogel. He argued that in certain arid or floodplain environments, the need to manage water on a massive scale, through irrigation, dikes, or canals, inevitably leads to a certain kind of society. Think of ancient Egypt, completely dependent on the annual flood of the Nile, with a powerful state and a god-king, the pharaoh, who was responsible for ensuring the flood's success. Or think of ancient Mesopotamia, where complex irrigation systems fed the world's first cities. Wittfogel's hydraulic hypothesis suggests that whoever controls the water controls the people. Power flows from the ability to organize the labor to build and maintain the waterworks and to manage the distribution of the resources, the water and the food, that they produce. The Kasarabe culture fits this model beautifully. In their world, wealth wasn't measured in land ownership as we know it, because most of the land was unusable for half the year. Wealth and power came from controlling the infrastructure. The political leaders, whether you call them chiefs, priests, or kings, would have derived their authority from their ability to manage this vast system. They were the ones who held the generational knowledge of hydrology. They were the ones who could direct the massive seasonal labor projects. Your political influence wasn't based on how much gold you had, but on how good you were at large-scale plumbing. The original plumber kings, if you will. These elites would have overseen the storage and redistribution of the massive fish harvest, ensuring the community was fed and that there was a surplus for trade and for supporting craft specialists. Archaeologists debate the degree of political centralization that existed. Was this a single unified state, a kingdom of the floods ruled from a central capital, or was it a more decentralized network of powerful competing chiefdoms, each controlling its own section of the landscape, but sharing a common culture and technology? The evidence is still being pieced together, but the sheer integration of some of the causeway and canal systems suggests a high degree of cooperation at the very least. Below this elite class of water managers and ritual specialists, you would have the vast majority of the population. Their job description was basically expert mud mover and fish wrangler, which, to be fair, sounds a lot more interesting than most office jobs today. These were the people who did the hard, physical work of maintaining the weirs, planting crops on the mounds and harvesting the fish. And then, thanks to the food surplus generated by the aquaculture, you would have had specialists, talented potters creating beautiful ceramics, skilled artisans making tools from bone and stone, and traders who would travel the causeways and canals. Life in this world would have been shaped by the rhythm of water, and communication across the vast flooded landscape would have been a unique challenge. Imagine you're on one settlement mound, and you need to coordinate with a village on another mound 5 miles away. Shouting is not an option. Archaeologists have found large, beautifully crafted trumpets made from conch shells in Kasarabe sites. These shells must have been traded from the distant ocean. When blown, they produce a deep, resonant sound that would carry for miles across the surface of the water. It's very likely these weren't just for music or ceremonies. They were a communication device, a long-distance signaling system to coordinate the start of a harvest, summon people for a construction project, or warn of danger. It was their version of a text message, sent on the humid air. So you have a complex, likely hierarchical society, with leaders, workers, and specialists. A society whose politics, economy, and possibly even religion were all interwoven with their mastery of the seasonal flood. They were a people who didn't just adapt to their environment. They met it on their own terms, transforming it into a source of immense and lasting power. But this is all a bit abstract, isn't it? A discussion of social models and political structures. What you really want to know is what it was like to be one of those people. What would you see, hear, and feel on a typical day in this civilization built on water? It's time to leave the high-level overview behind and zoom right into the heart of their world, life on a forest island. The first thing you hear is the sound. Before you even open your eyes, the morning chorus of the Amazon begins its daily performance. It's not a gentle bird song. It's a raucous, chaotic symphony of howler monkeys roaring in the distance, parrots squawking, and a million insects buzzing and clicking. This is your alarm clock. You stir from your sleep on a woven mat inside your house. It's a sturdy, comfortable dwelling, built with a frame of hardwood poles and walls of woven branches packed with mud, a technique we call wattle and daub. The roof, most importantly, is a thick, high pyramid of thatched palm leaves, so steep that even the most torrential tropical downpour just slides right off. It's dark inside but cool, and smells of wood smoke, damp earth, and the lingering aroma of last night's meal. You step outside your door, and your world is the forest island. You are on top of one of the great lomas, a man-made hill raised 20 feet above the surrounding plain. Your village is a collection of dozens of these houses, arranged around a central open plaza, which is kept clear of vegetation. The island isn't just a platform for your homes, it's a carefully managed garden. Towering palm trees provide fruit, fiber, and thatch. You see patches of cultivated ground where beans, squash, and sweet potatoes grow, their vines snaking around the trunks of papaya trees. The air is humid, but here on the mound, you might catch a slight breeze that doesn't exist down on the plain. This island is your refuge, your farm, your entire universe for much of the year. Your life is a tale of two seasons, and your daily routine depends entirely on whether the world around you is made of grass or water. Let's say it's the dry season. After a simple breakfast, you and the other adults prepare for a day of work out on the plains. You walk to the edge of your island, down the packed earth ramp, and step onto one of the great causeways. It stretches before you, a straight, elevated path leading to the horizon. Your daily commute is a walk on this ancient highway. Today's task might be communal labor, repairing a section of a fish weir that was damaged in the last flood, or extending a canal. Or you might be heading to a patch of lower ground to tend to a field of maize. Or perhaps you are part of a hunting party, heading for a distant patch of forest known to be good for deer or capybara. The world feels vast, hot, and open. Now imagine you wake up to the same monkey choir, but it's the wet season. You step outside your house and the world is transformed. The grasslands are gone, replaced by a single vast, shimmering sheet of water that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The causeways have vanished beneath the flood. Your forest island is now a true island. Your commute today will not be on foot. Moored next to the ramp at the edge of your village is your dugout canoe. Today, your work is on the water. You might paddle out to the now submerged fish weirs to check the basket traps at their apex, pulling in a writhing haul of fish. You might glide through the flooded forest, a strange, beautiful world where you can paddle among the treetops, gathering fruits and nuts. Your daily commute has transformed you from a highway driver into a Venetian gondolier, just with more piranhas and fewer tourists. Regardless of the season, a significant part of your day would revolve around food processing. A staple of your diet is manioc, a starchy root that is a powerhouse of calories. But many varieties are naturally poisonous, containing cyanide. Getting dinner ready involves a complex, multi-step detoxification process of peeling, grating, soaking, and squeezing the pulp in a long woven tube to remove the toxins before it can be safely cooked into flour or flatbreads. It really raises the stakes on your cooking skills when slightly undercooked could mean mildly poisonous. You'd also see evidence of garden hunting. The island's vegetation isn't just for human consumption. Certain plants are encouraged to grow because they attract specific animals, say, fruit trees for birds and monkeys, or starchy roots for large pig-like rodents called pacus. It's a clever way to make the game come to you. As the day ends, you gather with your family around the cooking fire. The community plaza is filled with the sounds of conversation, children playing, and the rhythmic thump of someone grinding maize. It is still a matter of speculation how these dense communities manage sanitation. On a crowded island with hundreds of people, where do you put the trash and human waste? Were there designated pits? Was it systematically used as fertilizer for the gardens? This seemingly mundane question is a huge piece of the puzzle for understanding their long-term success. But for you, here and now, it's just home. The sky turns a brilliant orange, then a deep purple. If it's the dry season, the stars are incredibly bright in the clear air. If it's the wet season, the night is filled with the deafening chorus of frogs, and the sky is reflected in the still water around you, blurring the line between heaven and earth. You eat your fill, feeling the deep, satisfying security that this engineered world provides. Which begs the question, what exactly is in your bowl? What did this incredible system actually put on the dinner table? So you're sitting there by the fire at the end of a long day, a clay bowl warm in your hands. What's on the menu in the ancient Llanos de Moxos? The first thing you need to do is banish any romanticized images you might have of a meager, hard-won meal for a struggling hunter-gatherer. This wasn't a society living on the edge of starvation, far from it. This was a culture that had achieved profound food security. This was a foodie paradise. The absolute heart of your meal, the foundation of this entire civilization, is fish. The bowl in your hands is likely filled with a hearty stew, and the main ingredient is the bounty of the Weirs. During the harvest season, when the floodwaters recede, the amount of fish collected would have been almost unimaginable. We're talking tons of it. You'd have huge, meaty catfish, the delicious fruit-eating pacu, and a dozen other species. The problem wasn't getting enough fish. The problem was what to do with all of it before it spoiled in the tropical heat. So the Kasarabe were masters of food preservation. Villages would have been thick with the fragrant smoke from racks of fish being slowly smoked over hardwood fires. Other fish would be salted, using salt traded from salt flats in the region, and laid out on woven mats to dry in the sun until they were as hard as a board. This was the original protein bar, just a lot less chewy and with fewer unpronounceable ingredients. This preserved fish was the community's wealth, a stable, reliable source of protein that could be stored for months, feeding the population through the dry season and acting as a buffer against any other food shortages. But man cannot live on fish alone, so alongside the chunks of smoked fish in your stew, you have the carbohydrates, the fuel grown right there on your island mound. The stew is likely thickened with flour from manioc, that staple root you spent part of your day processing. There are also chunks of sweet potato, squash, and perhaps some beans. On the side, there's a warm, flat bread, also made from either manioc or maize flour, perfect for soaking up the last bits of broth. This is a balanced, nutritious meal. The fish provides the protein and healthy fats. The root vegetables and grains provide the energy-rich calories. And it doesn't stop there. Sprinkled throughout the stew and perhaps in a side dish of its own is a medley of other plants from the managed gardens and the surrounding forest. The leaves of a native spinach-like plant, fiery chilies for a bit of a kick, and maybe the sweet, starchy fruit of the peach palm. This wasn't just subsistence, it was a cuisine, with flavors and textures developed over centuries. For dessert, you might have a sweet, juicy papaya or a handful of nuts. While fish was king, they were by no means exclusively pescatarians. They were doing surf and turf before the term was even invented. The turf might be a piece of smoked capybara, the world's largest rodent, which can weigh up to 65 kilograms or 140 pounds. These semi-aquatic animals would have thrived in the wetlands and been a prime target for hunters. You might also eat venison from the small deer of the savanna, or Muscovy duck, a large bird native to the region that was likely semi-domesticated. Even caiman, the local alligator relative, might find its way into the pot. While this hunting provided welcome variety, it was likely a supplement to the main protein source from the Weirs. Bioarchaeologists who study human remains still debate the exact proportions of these different food sources in the diet, using a technique called stable isotope analysis on bones to see what percentage of their protein came from fish versus land animals. This picture of abundance and diversity directly contradicts one of the most influential ideas in Amazonian archaeology. For decades, the field was dominated by the theories of an American archaeologist named Betty Meggers. In her 1971 book, Amazonia, Man and Culture in a Counterfeit Paradise, she argued forcefully that the Amazon was essentially a trap. Its soils were too poor and its resources, particularly protein, too scarce and scattered to ever support large, complex societies. She called it a counterfeit paradise because while it looked lush and green, it was, in her view, a nutritional desert that would always hold humanity back. Her theory was hugely influential, but it turns out she was wrong, especially before we had satellites that could spot giant prehistoric fish farms from space. The Kasarabe and their incredible aquaculture system are the ultimate refutation of her environmental determinism. They didn't succumb to their environment's limitations. They harnessed its unique rhythm to create an empire of food. They even had clever tricks for fishing beyond the Weirs. In smaller, contained bodies of water like a reservoir or a slow-moving creek, they would use what's known as barbasco, or fish poison. They would crush the roots of certain plants that produce a toxin that affects fish but is harmless to humans when cooked. They'd release this into the water, and the stunned fish would float to the surface ready to be scooped up in nets. It's a stunningly efficient, if dramatic, way to fill your basket. So, as you finish your meal, you are left with a sense of deep satisfaction. Your bowl contained the products of a sophisticated, multi-layered food system, one that combined aquaculture, agriculture, horticulture, and hunting. But how did you cook this stew? What was your bowl made of? What tools did you use to harvest the manioc and butcher the fish? To understand a people, you have to look at the things they made, the objects of their daily lives. To truly know a people, you have to look at the things they held in their hands. You have to sift through the soil of centuries and find the objects they created, used, and left behind. So now you're not just an observer or a builder, you're an archaeologist. You're kneeling on the rich, dark earth of a Kasarabe mound, carefully brushing away the dirt from a fragment of the past. And the first thing you find, the thing you will always find, is pottery. Pottery is the plastic of the ancient world. It's everywhere, it's incredibly durable, and it tells 1,000 stories. Future archaeologists are going to spend way too much time analyzing the different designs on our broken coffee mugs. The Kasarabe were master potters. The sheer volume of ceramic sherds, broken pieces of pottery on their settlement mounds, is astounding. They weren't just making crude, functional bowls. They developed a distinct and beautiful ceramic tradition. You unearth a large piece of a bowl. It's well made, the clay expertly fired. The surface is decorated with fine, incised lines that form elegant geometric patterns, spirals, zigzags, and stepped motifs. Some pieces you find are painted with a slip of red or orange clay before firing, giving them a vibrant finish. As you piece fragments together, a whole world of different vessels emerges. There are huge, thick-walled jars, likely used for storing water or brewing a fermented manioc or maize beer, which was a staple in many ancient American societies. There are blackened, fire-smudged cooking pots, their utilitarian purpose obvious. And then there are the finer, more delicate bowls and plates, perhaps used for serving food. Archaeologists have an ongoing discussion about the function of the most ornate vessels. Were they reserved for an elite class, used only in special ceremonies? Or were they more widely distributed, a way for many families to express their identity and display a bit of status? Of course, life requires more than just pots. You also need tools. As your excavation continues, you find a polished stone axe head. It's smooth, cool to the touch, and still feels lethally sharp. It would have been hafted onto a wooden handle and used for clearing trees to build houses or make canoes. Stone was a precious commodity here on the alluvial plain. It had to be imported from harder, rockier areas, probably through trade. You also find the essential tools for food processing: a large flat grinding stone or metate, and its handheld roller, the mano. This is the ancient equivalent of a food processor, used for grinding maize into flour and dried manioc into powder. This reliance on stone, bone, and clay highlights a crucial point. In school, many of us learn about the three-age system: the Stone Age, followed by the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age. It's a useful way to classify the prehistory of Europe and the Near East. But that system is completely irrelevant here. The Kasarabe, like the Maya or the Inca, are proof that you don't need metallurgy to build a complex, sophisticated civilization. They created their vast, engineered world without a single nail, screw, or metal shovel. Theirs was a different path of technological development, one that perfected the use of organic materials, stone, and fired clay. Many of the most important tools, of course, have long since vanished. 90% of their material world was probably biodegradable. It's the ultimate sustainable lifestyle, but a real headache for archaeologists who are basically left with the pots and rocks. You have to look for indirect evidence. You find small, fired clay discs with a hole in the center. These are spindle whorls, weights used in hand spinning to turn fibers like cotton into thread. So, they had a textile industry. You can imagine them weaving that thread into clothing, hammocks, and crucially, the vast nets they would have used in their fishing. You also find beautifully carved tools made from the dense bones of animals like deer and jaguars. You might unearth a delicate needle for sewing, a sharp awl for punching holes in leather, or a finely barbed fish hook that looks like it could still land a catch today. Digging carefully around the edges of what was once a pond, you might find some more unusual artifacts. Small, hollow ceramic figurines, shaped like turtles or birds, with little clay pellets inside. When you shake them, they rattle. These were musical instruments, part of the soundtrack of their lives. You also find curious ceramic blocks carved with intricate geometric patterns. These are thought to be stamps, which they would dip in pigment, made from plants or minerals and used to decorate their skin for ceremonies or perhaps to print designs onto their woven cloth. So piece by piece, a more tangible picture of their world comes into focus. It's a world of incised pottery and polished stone axes, of bone needles and cotton thread, of dugout canoes and vast fishing nets. It's a world of practical, ingenious tools designed for a life of farming, fishing, and building. But as you look at the recurring symbols on their pottery, the geometric stamps, the animal-shaped rattles, you start to wonder. These objects are clearly more than just functional. They are imbued with meaning, with an artistic and symbolic sensibility. It suggests a rich inner world, a cosmology, and it makes you look back at the landscape itself, at those massive earthworks, and ask a new question. Were they also more than just functional? You're holding a piece of their world in your hand, a beautifully decorated pottery sherd. The geometric patterns swirl and repeat, seeming to follow a hidden logic. For a long time, you might assume they're just that: decoration, an expression of an artistic impulse. But what if they're more? What if the patterns that mattered most to the Kasarabe weren't just the small ones they etched into clay, but the massive ones they etched into the world itself? You stand up and look out from your perch on the mound, and you start to see the entire landscape not just as a marvel of engineering, but as a canvas of meaning. This is where the journey takes a turn, from the practical to the profound. You have to remember, for the Kasarabe, the sky was not just a pretty backdrop. It was their clock, their calendar, and their map. In a world without written schedules or digital alerts, the sun, moon, and stars were the ultimate timekeepers. The position of the sun on the horizon at sunrise told you the time of year with unerring accuracy. And for a society whose entire existence depended on the predictable rhythm of the annual flood, knowing the time of year was a matter of life and death. You had to know when to prepare the weirs, when to plant the last of the dry season crops, and when to expect the life-giving and life-altering waters to rise. With this in mind, archaeologists began to look at the orientation of the Kasarabe earthworks with a new eye. Using precise GPS mapping and satellite imagery, they measured the alignment of the major structures, the long, straight causeways and the central axes of the large settlement mounds. And they found something extraordinary. They are not oriented randomly. They are not simply aligned to the cardinal directions of north, south, east, and west. Instead, a significant number of them are aligned with the heavens. Specifically, they point to the position of the sunrise and sunset on the solstices. Think about it. On the longest day of the year, the June solstice, the sun rises at its most northeasterly point on the horizon. On the shortest day of the year, the December solstice, it rises at its most southeasterly point. These two positions are the fixed goalposts of the solar year, and the Kasarabi built their world to point at them. These people didn't just circle a date on a calendar. They built a multi-mile-long earthen embankment to point directly at it. It's a level of commitment to your schedule that most of us can barely comprehend. This is a practice we see in other ancient cultures all over the globe. The most famous example, of course, is Stonehenge in England, whose main axis is famously aligned to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset. It's clear that for many ancient peoples, building a physical connection between their earthly monuments and the cosmic cycles was profoundly important, so you have to reimagine the purpose of these structures. That long causeway you walked on earlier, it wasn't just a highway and a dike. It was also the gnomon of a giant sundial, a sacred line connecting the human world to the sun. Imagine the power of that. You are standing in the central plaza of your village on the morning of the December solstice. The air is tense with anticipation. The chief or shaman begins a ceremony. And then as the sun breaks the horizon, it doesn't just rise anywhere. It appears perfectly framed at the far end of the Great Causeway, sending a beam of light directly down the path and into the heart of your community. This was probably the ancient equivalent of a big New Year's Eve celebration. It was a moment of immense spiritual power, a sign that the universe was in order, that the seasons were turning as they should, and that the leaders who understood and presided over this celestial event held the true knowledge and favor of the gods. It remains a topic of intense research and debate, just how complex their astronomical knowledge truly was. Were they only tracking the solar solstices? Or did they also align structures to the equinoxes or to the cycles of the moon? Some researchers suggest that certain alignments might correspond to the rising or setting of particularly bright and important stars. The Pleiades star cluster, for example, is a crucial seasonal marker for many indigenous peoples throughout South America. Its appearance in the pre-dawn sky often signals the beginning of the rainy season. It's entirely possible the Kasarabi were tracking this and other stellar events as well. This adds a completely new dimension to their society. They weren't just brilliant engineers and farmers, they were practical astronomers. They created a sacred geography, writing their cosmology onto the surface of the earth. Their entire world was a temple, an observatory, and a farm, all rolled into one. Those causeways were simultaneously a highway, a dike, and a cosmic clock. Your modern roads just give you traffic jams and disappointment. This fusion of the practical and the sacred is likely the key to their entire worldview. There was no separation between the mundane work of maintaining a canal and the sacred duty of maintaining cosmic harmony. It was all the same thing. And if their worldview is so profoundly embedded in the very layout of their world, then surely it must also be visible in their art. It's time to look again at those broken pieces of pottery, not as mere objects, but as tablets telling the stories of the gods, the animals, and the stars. You pick up one of the larger pottery fragments you excavated earlier. The geometric patterns you noticed before now seem different. They're not just decoration. Knowing that these people aligned their entire world with the cosmos, you start to see these patterns as a kind of language. The zigzag that repeats around the rim of the bowl. Is it just a zigzag? Or is it a symbol of the great anaconda, the mythical creator snake whose body is the river itself? Or maybe it represents the lightning that flashes across the sky at the start of the rainy season. That repeating spiral? Is it the shell of a river snail, a source of food? Or the eternal cycle of flood and drought, life and death? Art historians and archaeologists continue to debate the meaning of these recurring abstract symbols. Trying to decode them is a bit like trying to understand modern art. You stand there, nodding thoughtfully, saying, "Ah yes, the inherent duality," when really you're just hoping someone else knows what's going on. But it's clear these designs were more than just pretty patterns. They were a shared visual vocabulary, a way of reinforcing their understanding of the world. but it's on the more elaborate vessels that the Kasarabe truly open a window into their souls. Here, they move beyond abstract symbols to figurative art, and you get to meet the inhabitants of their world, both natural and supernatural. The animals depicted are rarely the mundane creatures of daily life. You don't see many pottery capybaras. Instead, you see the great power animals of the Amazonian cosmos. You see the jaguar, the apex predator of the Americas, its body often rendered in sleek, powerful lines, its fangs bared. For countless South American cultures, the jaguar represents the night, the underworld power and shamanic authority. It is the animal that can cross between the worlds of the living and the dead. Then you see the snake, almost always a massive anaconda, the undisputed ruler of the watery realm. It's often shown with cosmic symbols, representing its role as a creator being, the source of all rivers and life. And finally, you see the eagle, usually the magnificent harpy eagle, one of the world's largest birds of prey. It represents the celestial realm, the sun, the power of the heavens. This trinity, jaguar, snake, and eagle, represents the three layers of their cosmos: the underworld, earth, the watery middle world, and the sky. Even more fascinating are the depictions of people. They aren't simple portraits of daily life. No one is shown sitting around weaving a basket or preparing manioc. The human figures you see are almost always masked, wearing elaborate feathered headdresses and ornate costumes. They are captured in the middle of a dynamic pose, dancing, drumming, or holding a ceremonial object. These are not ordinary people. They are ritual specialists. They are the shamans and priests you imagined presiding over the solstice ceremonies. And most intriguing of all are the beings that are not quite human and not quite animal. You see a figure with a human body but the head and fangs of a jaguar. Another has wings like an eagle. These are anthropomorphic beings, and they are a classic representation of shamanism. The belief was that a powerful shaman, often with the help of psychoactive plants, could transform, taking on the spirit and the power of their animal counterpart. This belief in transforming into a jaguar really puts a new spin on the idea of having a spirit animal. For them, it wasn't just a fun quiz on the internet. It was a core part of their religion and their understanding of power. Some of these pots seem to tell a complete story, a single scene from a myth. One vessel might show a hero battling a giant caiman. Another might depict a procession of masked dancers, their movements frozen in clay for 1,000 years. While other cultures in the Americas, like the famous Moche of Peru, created stunningly realistic ceramic portraits, the Kasarabi seem to have been more interested in capturing the essence of their spiritual world. Their pottery wasn't meant to show you what they looked like, but what they believed. Sometimes the form of the pot itself is a marvel. You might find a vessel known as a bridge spout bottle, with two spouts connected by a solid handle. This is a design typically found hundreds of miles away, high up in the Andes Mountains, and its presence here is a clear sign of long-distance trade and cultural exchange. Some of these are even whistling pots. They are designed so that when you pour liquid out of one spout, the shifting air pressure is forced through a tiny hidden hole, creating a high-pitched whistle, often in the shape of a bird's call. It's the ancient equivalent of a kettle that tweets when it's done, just a lot more artistic and probably used for more interesting beverages than Earl Grey. This level of ceramic technology, combined with the complex iconography, speaks of a stable, well-fed society that could afford to support artisans of incredible skill. As you look over all these artifacts, the tools, the ceremonial objects, the storytelling pots, and think back to the vast cosmically aligned landscape, a new picture of the Kasarabi emerges. This isn't just a collection of small, independent villages sharing a few ideas. The level of social organization, technological sophistication, and shared ideology is just too great. It hints at something bigger, something more centralized and complex. It hints at cities, the very thing that was thought to be impossible in this green, watery world. Let's talk about a word. A simple four-letter word that, until very recently, was almost taboo to use when discussing the ancient Amazon. That word is city. For the better part of a century, the consensus was clear. The Amazon never hosted cities. It couldn't. The environment was wrong, the food was scarce, the challenges too great. The Casarabe and their incredible infrastructure already poked 1,000 holes in that theory, but the final, definitive evidence was missing. A village on a mound, no matter how sophisticated, is not a city. For that, you need scale, planning, and a concentration of civic and ceremonial power. For a long time, saying Amazonian city in an archaeology conference was a good way to get laughed out of the room. Now, it's the hottest topic around. The game changer was a technology called LiDAR. Think of it as a kind of archaeological superpower. A plane or helicopter flies over the jungle, and a device on board shoots millions of laser pulses down towards the ground every second. Most of the pulses hit the leaves and branches of the dense canopy, but a few find their way through the gaps and hit the forest floor. By measuring the tiny differences in the return time of all these pulses, a powerful computer can digitally strip away all the vegetation, revealing a breathtakingly detailed 3D map of the naked earth beneath. It's basically X-ray vision for the landscape, and when archaeologists aimed this new superpower at the heart of the Casarabe territory, what they found was stunning. They found cities, not just a hypothesis, not just an educated guess. They found the undeniable architectural footprint of large, planned urban centers, hidden in plain sight for 600 years. The two largest that have been identified so far are named Kotoka and Landivar, and these were not just overgrown villages. They were complex, deliberately designed settlements on a scale previously unimaginable for this region. You have to picture their layout. At the center of a site like Kotoka, you don't just have a mound, you have a civic and ceremonial core. This includes massive terraced platform mounds, some rising over 20 feet high, arranged around plazas. This was their acropolis, the sacred and political heart of the city, where the most important temples, palaces, and public buildings would have stood. And radiating out from this central core, the entire landscape is structured. You have a dense pattern of smaller house mounds, canals, and reservoirs, all integrated into a coherent plan. But perhaps the most striking feature is the defenses. Both Kotoka and Landivar are encircled by a series of massive concentric earthen walls and deep moats. Kotoka has 3 of these defensive rings. Landivar has 2. Building 3 giant concentric moats around your city sends a very clear message to your neighbors. It's the ancient equivalent of putting up a no trespassing sign, a motion sensor light, and getting a very large, very mean dog. These defenses speak of a society concerned with warfare, with protecting a concentrated population and its resources, and with the ability to mobilize the enormous amount of labor needed for such a monumental undertaking. The sheer scale of the construction is difficult to process. One researcher calculated that the volume of earth moved to build the main civic ceremonial core and defensive structures at Kotoka was more than 10 times the volume of the Great Pyramid of Cholula in Mexico, which is itself the largest pyramid on the planet by volume. This was a society capable of landscape transformation on an Egyptian scale, but using earth and clay instead of quarried stone. The idea of an earthen city isn't without precedent in the Americas. North of Mexico, the largest pre-Columbian city was Cahokia, near modern St. Louis. At its peak around 1100 CE, it was a sprawling urban center with a population of tens of thousands, dominated by a series of enormous earthen mounds. Cahokia proves that you can have a true city without cut stone masonry. Kotoka and Landivar are the Amazonian expression of this same tradition of monumental earthen architecture. These discoveries are so new that the big questions are just beginning to be formulated. These 2 major urban centers are only about 30 miles apart. The key question that now drives research is whether Kotoka and Landivar were twin capitals of a single powerful unified state, or if they were the competing political centers of rival chiefdoms locked in a dynamic relationship of alliance and conflict. What is clear is that they were the hubs of this entire civilization. They were the nodes that controlled the vast network of causeways, canals, and fish weirs that stretched for miles in every direction. They were the places where the wealth of the region, the fish, the grain, the exotic trade goods, was concentrated. They were the beating heart of the Casarabe world. So now you have these great centers of population and power, humming with life. The next question is obvious. How were they connected? How did goods, people, and ideas travel between these cities and the vast territories they controlled? It's time to travel the highways and waterways of this ancient Amazonian kingdom. You are standing in the grand central plaza of Kotoka. Around you are the great ceremonial mounds, the hubs of power. But the real power, the lifeblood of the city, isn't just in these central structures. It's in the lines that radiate outwards from them. You look past the outer defensive moats and see them stretching into the distance, the raised causeways, the engineered canals. These aren't just local roads. They are the arteries and veins of a sprawling economic body, pumping people, goods, and ideas across the entire region. Let's start with the local network. Imagine it's a market day. You see a steady stream of people walking along the causeways towards the city. They come from the smaller satellite villages that dot the landscape for miles around. They carry their goods in woven baskets on their backs, supported by a strap across their foreheads. They bring surpluses from their own local production. One family might bring baskets overflowing with smoked catfish. Another brings beautifully crafted pottery, their village's specialty. A third might carry bundles of raw cotton or brilliantly colored feathers from parrots they've raised. This was the ultimate farmer's market. In the city, they would trade their wares for things they needed: a sturdy stone axe head that originated in a distant quarry, salt for preserving their own fish, or a finely woven textile from a specialized urban workshop. The canals would be just as busy, filled with dugout canoes laden with goods, gliding silently towards the city's heart. This intricate network of causeways and canals was the scaffolding that held their economy together, integrating the entire territory into one cohesive unit. But their world was much larger than just the land they themselves had reshaped. Following the great rivers that wound through their territory, they would have traveled by canoe to trade with neighboring cultures. The Amazon is a mosaic of different environments, and no single group had access to everything. The Kasarabi might have traded their seemingly endless supply of preserved fish for high-quality stone like flint or chert from a group that lived in a hillier region, or for special woods and plant fibers for their construction and crafts. They may have also traded for powerful medicinal plants or the psychoactive substances, like certain snuffs or brews, that were central to the shamanic rituals you saw depicted on their pottery. The most astonishing connections, however, were the long-distance ones. For a very long time, the Amazon rainforest and the Andes Mountains were seen by scholars as two completely separate worlds, two different spheres of human development. But the evidence found in Kasarabe sites utterly shatters that idea. In the remains of their cities, archaeologists have found artifacts that could only have come from the Andes, hundreds of miles away, over a formidable mountain barrier. You see it in their pottery. Those bridge spout bottles are a classic Andean design. You might find a small decorative piece of hammered bronze, a metal that the Kasarabi did not produce but that Andean cultures had mastered. The giant conch shells they used as trumpets had to have been traded from the Pacific Ocean, which means they traveled up and over the Andes to get here. Their delivery network was incredible. They were shipping fragile pottery and sacred shells hundreds of miles without a single roll of bubble wrap. It's a point of contention among archaeologists whether this long-distance trade was handled by professional merchants who made the entire journey, or if it was the result of down-the-line exchange, where goods were passed from one culture to the next, gaining value with each step. But either way, the connection was real and vital. Imagine traveling for months over mountains and through jungles, just to trade a bag of dried fish for a cool-looking seashell. Some of the most valuable trade goods were likely sacred items, like the spondylus shell. This is a spiny oyster with a brilliant red-orange shell that was considered the ultimate prestige good in the Andes. It was literally called the food of the gods, and was more valuable than gold. Finding even a fragment of this shell in a Kasarabi city is proof that they were participants in the great continent-spanning prestige economies of their day. This level of infrastructural and economic integration is not unique in the Americas. High in the Andes, the Inca would later build their famous Capac Ñan, a massive, paved road system that stitched their empire together. The Kasarabe causeways, while built of earth for a watery world, reflect the same fundamental principle, that connectivity is power. By building and controlling these networks, the lords of Kotoka and Landivar could move goods, information, and almost certainly armies, solidifying their influence over a vast region. They were not an isolated jungle tribe. They were a major node in a continental network. a cosmopolitan center where goods and ideas from the mountains met the bounty of the wetlands. Their world was far more connected and far more complex than anyone had ever dared to imagine. And all of it, the cities, the farms, the trade routes, was only possible because they lived in a very specific and very challenging environment. It's time to understand the climate that made them. To truly understand the Kasarabe, you have to see their environment not as a static backdrop, but as an active and powerful partner. This entire civilization was a duet between human ingenuity and a very specific set of environmental conditions. They didn't just conquer the Llanos de Moxos, they harnessed it. And it turns out this region, for all its challenges, was uniquely suited to be harnessed in this way. It was a landscape of extremes, but it was also a landscape of profound predictability. First, let's talk about the flood itself. Where did all that water come from? It wasn't just a case of a few heavy local rainstorms. The Llanos de Moxos sits in a massive geological bowl, and it acts as the drainage basin for a whole network of rivers that have their sources high up in the Andes Mountains, hundreds of miles to the west. This is the crucial factor. The annual flood was powered by the melting of mountain snow and the predictable rainy season in the high Andes. This made the flood an incredibly reliable event. It wasn't a freak occurrence, it was the metronome of their world. You could practically set your calendar by it. This reliability is what allowed them to invest generations of labor into building permanent infrastructure. You don't build 10,000 fish weirs if you're not absolutely certain the fish are going to show up every year. This annual pulse of water was the engine, but the topography of the land was the transmission, allowing that power to be used. The Llanos de Moxos is almost perfectly flat. We're talking a gradient of inches per mile in some places. It is flatter than a pancake that's been run over by a steamroller. This means that when the Andean-fed rivers overflowed their banks, the water didn't rush across the land in a destructive soil-stripping flash flood. Instead, it spread out slowly, gently, like a bathtub overflowing in slow motion. This created a shallow, slow-moving sheet of water, which is the perfect condition for their entire system. You can guide and channel gentle flows with low earthen walls. You can travel by canoe on a placid temporary lake, and your earthen mound homes won't be washed away by a raging current. On top of this, the flood brought an annual gift: fertilizer. The waters that flowed down from the Andes were rich with silt and sediment, full of nutrients eroded from the mountains. Every year, as the floodwaters settled, they deposited a fresh, thin layer of this fertile silt all over the plains. This constant, natural replenishment of the soil is what allowed them to sustain agriculture for centuries, avoiding the soil depletion problem that plagued so many other tropical societies. The ancient Egyptians had a very similar relationship with their river. They were so dependent on the Nile's annual flood that they invented nileometers, complex calibrated structures built into the riverbank to measure the height of the flood. Too low and the fields wouldn't be watered or fertilized, meaning famine. Too high, and it would destroy villages. The Kasarabe would have had their own, less monumental ways of reading the signs, of knowing whether the coming flood would be a bountiful one. Paleoclimatologists are working to determine if the rise of the Kasarabe culture coincided with a particular climatic sweet spot. The evidence suggests that their system flourished during a period of relative stability, a Goldilocks climate that was just right. The dry season was pronounced enough to expose the land for building and maintenance. The wet season was powerful enough to drive the migration of fish and deposit the silt, but not so catastrophic that it regularly destroyed their infrastructure. This unique combination of factors, a predictable flood, a flat landscape, and self-renewing soil, created the perfect stage for their hydraulic society to perform its masterpiece. Their world was also filled with strange and wonderful ecological features, like the camelots, or floating meadows. These are massive tangled rafts of water hyacinths and other aquatic plants that drift on the surface of the floodwaters, creating mobile islands of life. Fish shelter under them, birds nest on them. Imagine trying to paddle your canoe home from the market and finding your path blocked by a floating island of vegetation the size of a football field. It's a slightly more dramatic traffic jam than we're used to. The Kasarabe would have had to understand and navigate this ever-changing aspect of their flooded world. So you see, Their environment wasn't an obstacle. It was the source of their power. They read its rhythms, understood its mechanics, and then subtly, cleverly, tweaked the system to their own advantage. They built a civilization that was perfectly, exquisitely adapted to one very specific set of climatic and geographical rules. Their entire society, their food, their politics, their religion, was tuned like a fine instrument to the annual song of the flood. Which leads to a rather ominous question. What happens to a perfectly tuned instrument when the song changes? What happens to a civilization built on predictability when the climate itself becomes unpredictable? For nearly 1,000 years, the Kasarabe culture thrived. They built cities, they managed a continental-scale water system, they traded with distant empires, and they created a world in perfect harmony with their environment. And then, sometime around the year 1400 CE, they vanished. Not overnight, not in a single fiery cataclysm, but they faded from the archaeological record. The construction of the great mounds and causeways stopped. The urban centers of Kotoka and Landivar were gradually abandoned. The intricate pottery styles were replaced by simpler, less sophisticated wares. When the first Europeans arrived in the region more than a century later, the great civilization was already a memory, its cities being slowly consumed by the very nature it had once so masterfully controlled. This is the great mystery of the Llanos de Moxos. Why did it all end? The prime suspect, the one that looms largest over all the evidence, is the very partner that gave them their power, the climate. After centuries of being a relatively stable and predictable engine for their society, the climate changed. After being a reliable partner, it basically decided to change the rules of the game without telling anyone. Paleoclimatologists, by studying the layers of sediment in lake beds and analyzing ice cores drilled from Andean glaciers, have reconstructed the climate of the past. Their work shows that the 14th and 15th centuries were a time of significant instability across much of South America. For the Llanos de Moxos, this likely manifested as a series of extreme weather events, far outside the normal rhythm their society was built to handle. One possibility is a period of prolonged, severe drought. Several decades with significantly less rainfall in the Andes would mean the annual floods would weaken, or perhaps fail to arrive at all. For the Kasarabe, this would be an apocalypse. The fish weirs, the heart of their food system, would be left high and dry. The canals would turn to dusty ditches. The reservoirs would shrink and vanish. The thin layer of fertile silt would no longer be deposited. Their entire economic and agricultural foundation would crumble. Another, equally devastating possibility is the opposite extreme, a period of mega floods. A series of unusually wet years could have produced floods so massive that they simply overwhelmed the Kasarabe's infrastructure. Earthen walls and causeways that were sufficient for a normal flood would be washed away. Even the highest mounds might have been inundated, forcing people to abandon their homes and fields. This is a story that has played out before in the Americas. The most famous parallel is the collapse of the classic Maya civilization in the southern Yucatan Peninsula around 900 CE. For a long time, its cause was a profound mystery, but now, the overwhelming evidence points to a series of intense, multi-decade droughts that caused crop failures, famine, and the abandonment of their great stone cities. Running a complex society is a bit like a high-stakes Jenga game, and climate change just pulled out the bottom block. However, a major collapse like this is rarely due to a single cause. The climate shift was likely the catalyst, the massive external shock that destabilized the system. But internal factors almost certainly played a critical role in how the society ultimately broke apart. Remember those massive defensive moats around Kotoka and Landivar? They tell us that warfare was a part of their world. As the climate became more unpredictable and resources like food and clean water became scarcer, competition between different groups would have intensified. Small-scale conflicts could have escalated into destructive, endemic warfare, further destabilizing the region and making life in the large open cities untenable. There's also the possibility of social and political breakdown. The legitimacy of the ruling elite, the chiefs and shamans, was likely tied to their perceived ability to manage the floods and ensure prosperity through their rituals and knowledge. When the floods failed or became destructive, the faith of the common people in their leaders may have faltered. You can imagine the crisis of faith, The solstice ceremonies are performed, but the sun rises on a dry, cracked landscape where the flood should be. This could lead to internal revolts, civil strife, and the fracturing of the larger political system into smaller competing factions. So you have your choice of catastrophe: drought, flood, war, or plague. It's like a choose-your-own-adventure book, but every single ending is terrible. The collapse was likely not a single event, but a slow, grinding process over several generations. We see the archaeological signatures of collapse in the evidence. People stop building big public monuments and instead focus on survival. The quality of their crafts declines as society becomes less specialized. People abandon the vulnerable city centers and disperse into smaller, more mobile, and perhaps more hidden settlements. The exact sequence of events is still fiercely debated, but most researchers agree that a combination of factors is the only plausible explanation. Climate change delivered the initial crippling blow, and the society, weakened and stressed, succumbed to internal conflicts and social disintegration. It was a perfect storm of environmental and social crises. So, by the time the first Spanish expeditions pushed their way into this region in the 16th century, the world of the Casarabe was gone. The great cities were silent, already cloaked in a shroud of vegetation. The causeways were still visible, the mounds still rose above the plain, but the civilization that had built them was a ghost. Yet the sheer scale of these earthen ruins, these ghost prints on the land, must have been profoundly impressive, and they may have inadvertently fueled one of the most powerful and persistent myths the world has ever known. The world of the Casarabe faded, but it did not disappear entirely. It left behind a ghost, an echo in the memory of the people who came after, and a vast, enigmatic footprint on the land itself. And when a new kind of human arrived in this world, one with a single, all-consuming obsession, these echoes of a lost civilization would inadvertently fuel one of the most powerful and destructive myths in history: the legend of El Dorado. To understand how this happened, you have to place yourself in the mindset of a 16th century Spanish conquistador. You have just witnessed or heard about the unbelievable conquests of the Aztec in Mexico and the Inca in Peru, empires of staggering wealth, with temples plated in gold and treasures beyond imagining. It seemed logical, inevitable, that there must be a third great empire, a final, even richer prize hidden somewhere in the vast, unexplored heart of the continent. And a rumor, born in the mountains of what is now Colombia, gave this hope a name. The story they heard was about a ceremony performed by the Muisca people. When a new chief was inaugurated, his body would be coated with sticky tree resin and then covered entirely in fine gold dust. He would become El Dorado, the gilded man. He would then be taken to the center of the sacred lake Guatavita on a raft, where he would wash the gold from his body into the water, while his subjects threw gold and emerald offerings into the depths. This was a real ritual. But in the fevered imagination of the conquistadors, the story began to morph. The gilded man became a gilded king. The gilded king became the ruler of a golden kingdom. And the golden kingdom became a city, a lost city of pure gold called Manoa or Paititi, hidden somewhere in the jungle. It's probably the most extreme case of exaggeration in human history. And so the hunt began. Expedition after expedition plunged into the Amazon, seeking this glittering prize. The most famous was the disastrous 1541 expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro, the brother of the man who conquered the Inca. He marched from Quito with hundreds of Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous porters in search of El Dorado. The expedition was ravaged by disease, starvation, and attacks. A splinter group led by Francisco de Orellana was sent down a river to find food, but they ended up unable to return upstream and were forced to continue on, eventually navigating the entire length of the Amazon River. It was an incredible feat of exploration, but they found no gold. What Orellana did report seeing, however, were huge settlements along the riverbanks, dense populations, and organized bands of warriors. His account was largely dismissed back in Europe as self-serving fantasy, an attempt to excuse his failure to find El Dorado. But now, in light of what we know about the Casarabe and other complex Amazonian societies, his reports sound eerily plausible. The conquistadors had a very simple translation filter. Everything they heard, no matter how complex, came out as gold, and it's that way. Historians debate the extent to which indigenous peoples deliberately misled the Spanish, sending them on deadly treks into the deepest jungle just to be rid of them, versus genuinely trying to describe real places, either contemporary villages or the great ancestral sites like Cotoca, which the Spanish then willfully misinterpreted. Imagine the scene. A Spanish captain captures a local chief and, through a terrified, confused interpreter, demands to be shown the great cities of this land. The chief, trying to save his people, might describe the world of his ancestors, a world of great mounds, sprawling settlements, and causeways that stretched for miles. He might describe a powerful king who presided over grand ceremonies. To the gold-crazed Spaniard, what does that sound like? Mounds become pyramids, settlements become cities, causeways become paved roads, and a powerful king must, by definition, be a king with gold. The reality of the earthen cities of the past became the raw material for the fantasy of a golden city in the present. The myth took on a life of its own, becoming so powerful it even appeared on maps. Sir Walter Raleigh, the English courtier, led his own expedition in the 1590s. He failed, of course, but he returned to England and published a wildly popular book, complete with a map showing the precise location of the great and golden city of Manoa, on the shores of a massive, entirely fictitious lake called Perim. He basically just drew a giant lake on the map and wrote El Dorado here, which is a bold cartographical strategy. I'll give him that. This phantom lake and city would be copied onto maps of South America for the next 150 years, a testament to the power of wishful thinking. The obsession with El Dorado was, in the end, a great tragedy. It led to the deaths of thousands of Europeans and countless indigenous people. And ironically, the hunt for a city of gold blinded the explorers to the real wonder that was right in front of them. The evidence of a sophisticated, sustainable civilization that had mastered the Amazon on its own terms. As the first missionaries and colonists finally pushed their way into the Llanos de Moxos, they were not looking for earthen mounds and fish weirs. They were looking for gold and souls to convert. And this fundamental misunderstanding would shape their perception of the people and the landscape they encountered for centuries to come. The gold-crazed conquistadors came and went, leaving a trail of destruction but finding no El Dorado. A century passes. Now you arrive in the Llanos de Moxos with a different purpose. You are a Jesuit missionary in the late 17th century. Your goal is not treasure but the salvation of souls. You are a man of God but also a man of your time, and your mind is filled with a specific set of European ideas about God, nature, and humanity. These ideas will act as a powerful filter, fundamentally shaping what you see and, more importantly, what you don't. You are one of the first outsiders to live here, to document the land and its people. You are educated, observant, and you write detailed letters back to your superiors in Europe. You describe the strange landscape, the vast grassy plains that flood for half the year. You note the peculiar lomas, the forested mounds that rise above the floodwaters, and you see that the indigenous people, the Mojenos, have logically built their villages upon them. You walk along the calzadas, the long, straight earthen ridges that connect these villages, and you find them a great convenience for travel when the ground is swampy. You see the zigzag ditches and the large ponds. You see all the pieces of the Casarabe world. But you do not see the system. Why? Because your entire worldview tells you it's impossible. You are operating under a powerful intellectual framework, underpinned by concepts like the doctrine of discovery, which essentially declared that lands inhabited by non-Christians were empty, wild, and available for the taking. In your mind, there is a sharp dividing line between civilization and nature. Civilization is Europe, with its stone cities, its kings, its written laws, and its Christian God. Nature is the untamed wilderness, the New World, a place that is pristine and untouched, inhabited by natural men or savages, people who live in nature but do not shape it on a grand scale. It's a classic case of seeing what you want to see. If your theory is these people are simple, you're not going to accept evidence that they are also master hydraulic engineers who redesigned an entire province. So, you explain away the evidence in front of you. Those huge, regular mounds, they must be natural formations. Odd, certainly, but God moves in mysterious ways. Those long, straight causeways, they must be natural eskers, ridges of gravel and sand left behind by ancient rivers. The fact that they conveniently connect the natural mounds is just a happy coincidence that the natives have taken advantage of. The complex network of canals and weirs, you barely even notice them as a system. They are just ditches, maybe for some small-scale drainage around a village, the recent work of the people you see today. You are, after all, basically looking at the ruins of ancient Rome and concluding it must have been a really weird-looking mountain range. Your interpretation is made easier by the fact that the system you are seeing is a ruin. By the 1670s, when the Jesuits established their missions, the Kasarabi civilization has been gone for nearly 3 centuries. The great cities are completely overgrown. The canals are clogged with silt. The causeways are eroded and breached in places. The weirs are faint lines under the grass. You are seeing the faint skeletal remains of the system, not the living, breathing machine it once was. The population is also a fraction of what it was at its peak. The people living in much smaller, less complex societies. There is an ongoing discussion among ethnohistorians about how much traditional knowledge these 17th century Mojenos retained. Did they know the true purpose of the great works? Did they tell you stories of their mighty ancestors, the fish farmers? And if they did you simply dismiss them as fanciful myths, the tall tales of a simple people? Your letters back to Europe are filled with valuable ethnographic details, but they are also colored by your worldview. Some early chronicles from other parts of the continent are even more fantastical, describing tribes of one-eyed men, or people with their faces in their chests. These are likely misunderstandings of people wearing ceremonial masks, or just wild embellishments to make their accounts more exciting. In your case, your fantasy is more subtle. It is the fantasy of the pristine wilderness, the untouched land. Your official report back to Spain probably reads something like, Day 42. The landscape is suspiciously well organized. Must be a coincidence. The locals are nice, but they clearly didn't do this. Back to teaching catechism. This interpretation of a natural landscape inhabited by small, simple tribes became the bedrock truth. It was recorded, published, and accepted by scholars for the next 300 years. The true story of the Kasarabi was buried, not just under the Amazonian soil, but under the weight of this powerful and persistent colonial narrative. The evidence was there all along, hiding in plain sight, but no one had the conceptual framework to see it for what it was. So the question becomes, how do you finally break through 3 centuries of entrenched bias? How do you unearth a truth that has been so thoroughly buried? You need a new set of eyes, a tool that can see the world in a way no human ever could. For 300 years, the truth of the Llanos de Moxos lay sleeping under a double blanket, a physical one of jungle and savanna, and a conceptual one of historical bias. The story written by the Jesuit missionaries of a natural landscape and the simple people within it was so powerful that it became fact. Even as modern archaeology began in the 20th century, the scale of the challenge seemed insurmountable. How could you ever hope to map a landscape of thousands of square miles when it is covered in a dense, disorienting jungle? The traditional methods were heroic but painstakingly slow. Imagine yourself as an archaeologist in the 1980s. Your primary tools are a machete, a compass, and a measuring tape. You and your team would cut a long, narrow path called a transect through the suffocatingly thick undergrowth. You'd walk this line, peering into the vegetation on either side, hoping to spot the subtle rise of a mound or the depression of a canal. It was like trying to read a book by looking at it through a keyhole. You might find a causeway, but you could only map the 100 feet you could see before it vanished back into the green wall. You might spend an entire field season mapping just one small cluster of mounds. Traditional jungle archaeology was about 99% sweating and getting bitten by things, and 1% finding something. You could never see the big picture. Then, in the early 21st century, everything changed. A technology that was originally developed for military and meteorological purposes was adapted for archaeology, and it provided the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. We've mentioned it before, but it's time to truly appreciate the magic of LiDAR. Imagine you are flying in a small plane, crisscrossing the Llanos de Moxos in a precise grid pattern. Bolted to the belly of the plane is a device that is firing hundreds of thousands of laser pulses at the ground every single second. For each pulse, a sensor records its exact reflection time. The first reflection it gets is the first return, the laser bouncing off the highest point it hits, which is usually the top of the forest canopy. But the laser beam is not a single point. It spreads slightly. Some of its light finds a way through the leaves and branches and makes it all the way to the ground. This is the last return. The computer on board records all of this, billions of data points. You end up with a file so enormous you can't just open it in Microsoft Paint. It's the kind of data set that makes a normal computer just give up and decide to become a toaster instead. But once this data is processed, you can tell the software to do something amazing. Ignore all the first returns. In effect, you tell it to digitally deforest the entire landscape. And what you are left with is a stunningly precise, high-resolution 3D map of the bare earth, as if the jungle had never been there at all. This technology had already proven its worth elsewhere. In Cambodia, LiDAR surveys of the area around the famous temple of Angkor Wat revealed that the stone temples were not isolated monuments in the jungle, but the centers of a vast, low-density urban sprawl with roads, canals, and neighborhoods that covered an area the size of modern-day Paris. It completely rewrote the history of the Khmer Empire. And now, it was the Amazon's turn. The archaeologists who commissioned the first LiDAR surveys over the Kasarabe heartland must have felt an incredible sense of anticipation, and when the data finally came back and they loaded it onto their screens, it must have been one of the great eureka moments in modern archaeology. For the first time, they could see it all. Not just a few mounds, but thousands. Not just a fragment of a causeway, but the entire sprawling network of them, connecting settlements across dozens of miles. They saw the full, breathtaking layout of the cities of Kotoka and Landivar, with their concentric moats and ceremonial centers, previously invisible beneath the trees. They saw the thousands of fish weirs, their zigzag patterns forming a vast, geometric tapestry. The 300-year-old bias was shattered in a single image. There was no more ambiguity. This was not nature. This was a civilization. For the scientists who had spent their entire careers painstakingly mapping tiny sections of this world by hand, it must have been a mix of pure joy and the sudden realization that all their old maps were now basically obsolete. There is now a significant debate within archaeology about the ethics and future of the discipline in this new age. Does this ability to map everything from the air make the slow, hard work of on-the-ground excavation less important? The consensus is no. What LiDAR does is provide the map. It tells you where to dig to answer the most important questions, making archaeology more efficient and focused than ever before. In fact, the data is so precise it can sometimes reveal the ghostly footprints of things long vanished, faint depressions that mark ancient footpaths or crop lines. And as archaeologists began to zoom in on these new, perfect maps, they noticed another profound man-made feature of this landscape, one that was intimately tied to the mounds and the long-term success of their agriculture. They saw the soil itself, and it was black. The LiDAR has given you the map, the God's eye view of the lost civilization. Now you are back on the ground, standing on one of the great Kasarabe mounds, knowing exactly where you are in the grand scheme of things. You decide to dig a small test pit, just to see what's beneath the surface layer of leaves and roots. You push your shovel into the earth, and what comes up is not the reddish-orange, clay-heavy, nutrient-poor soil that is typical of so much of the Amazon basin. It's not the kind of soil that gives botanists and farmers nightmares. Instead, it is black. Impossibly, richly, profoundly black. It's soft and crumbly in your hands, smelling of life and damp earth, and it is full of strange inclusions. Tiny fragments of broken pottery and flecks of charcoal. You have just dug into one of the other great enigmas of the Amazon, Terra Preta de Indio, or Indian Black Earth. For centuries, explorers and settlers noticed these strange patches of incredibly fertile black soil scattered throughout the Amazon. They could be a few acres or hundreds of acres in size, and their fertility is legendary. This stuff is so fertile you could probably plant a wooden spoon in it, and it would start sprouting leaves. The surrounding jungle soil, meanwhile, has the nutritional value of a brick. For a long time, no one knew where it came from. Was it created by ancient volcanoes? The sediment of old lakes? The truth, when scientists finally pieced it together, was far more astonishing. It's man-made. Terra preta is an anthropogenic soil. It's a recipe, perfected over centuries. And its key ingredient is charcoal, but not just any charcoal. It's the product of low temperature, oxygen-poor burning, a process we would now call pyrolysis. Think of a smoldering, smoky fire rather than a hot, clean burning one. This process creates a very stable form of charcoal, now fashionably known as biochar, which is incredibly porous and resistant to breaking down. When added to soil, it acts like a sponge, holding onto water and nutrients that would otherwise be washed away by the torrential tropical rains. The other ingredients in the recipe are exactly what you see in your test pit. Countless pieces of crushed pottery, which also help with aeration and water retention, and a rich mix of organic waste. Their secret recipe for amazing soil was basically charcoal, broken pots, and last night's fish dinner. And this is the profound connection. The settlement mounds of the Kasarabi are giant deposits of this manufactured soil. As we touched on earlier, they were built up, generation after generation, with the accumulated trash of daily life. The sweepings from their hearths, full of charcoal and ash. The bones from the thousands of fish they ate, providing phosphorus. The broken pots, the food scraps, the human and animal waste. They turned their garbage heap into their garden. It's the most productive and successful example of composting in human history. Scientists are still debating whether this process began intentionally, or if it was an accidental byproduct of village life that people later noticed was incredibly beneficial. It's easy to imagine the first scenario. People just dump their trash in piles at the edge of the village. Over time, they notice that the plants that grow on these trash heaps, or middens, are much bigger and healthier than the ones in their other fields. And from that observation, a deliberate, sophisticated system of soil creation is born. They create a virtuous cycle. The fertile soil allows them to grow abundant crops on their flood-proof islands, which supports a large sedentary population, which in turn produces a steady stream of organic waste and charcoal that is used to create more fertile soil. This is a fundamentally different relationship with the land than the one that developed in many other parts of the world. Think of the Great Plains of North America. That region was blessed with incredibly deep, fertile soil, built up naturally over millennia of prairie grass growth and decay. When European settlers arrived with the steel plow, they broke the plains and mined that fertility, creating one of the most productive breadbaskets in the world. But because they weren't replenishing it, the system was unsustainable, culminating in the tragic Dust Bowl of the 1930s. The Kasarabi weren't mining their soil, they were building it. The fertility of their land was not a given, it was an achievement. The science behind this ancient technology is so advanced that modern researchers are still trying to catch up. They've discovered that Terra preta is teeming with a unique and complex community of beneficial microorganisms. This microbial life is a key part of the soil's incredible, long-lasting fertility, and scientists today are working to isolate these ancient microbes, hoping to use them to create new, sustainable fertilizers for the modern world. It is, quite literally, a living soil, a legacy of sustainable practice that has endured for centuries. So now, you have a society that engineered the flow of water to bring them food, and engineered the very soil to grow their crops. They shaped the life that swam in the rivers and the earth beneath their feet. When you combine these two revelations, it forces a complete and radical rethinking of our most basic assumptions about the Amazon. It forces you to look at the entire vast jungle and ask a new question. If this part of it was so thoroughly managed and transformed, what about the rest? What if the pristine, untouched wilderness we've always imagined is not that at all? Let's pause here, take a breath, and confront the single most revolutionary idea to come out of all this research. It's an idea that reframes everything you've ever been told about the Amazon, and perhaps about the relationship between humanity and nature itself. The Amazon is not a wilderness, it's a garden. A vast, ancient, continent-sized garden that has been managed, shaped, and enriched by human beings for thousands of years. The idea of the Amazon as a virgin wilderness, a pristine landscape untouched by humanity, is a myth. It's less virgin wilderness and more a very, very old allotment garden that's gotten a bit overgrown. This is a radical paradigm shift. For centuries, the story of the Amazon was one of human failure and insignificance in the face of an overwhelmingly powerful nature. The new story, the one the evidence of the Kasarabe and others tells us, is that humans were not insignificant at all. They were a keystone species, the master gardeners and engineers of this entire ecosystem. Let's just recap the evidence from the Llanos de Moxos. You have a society that built cities, moved millions of tons of earth to create a sophisticated water management system for aquaculture, and literally manufactured the fertile black soil that sustained their agriculture. Their corner of the world was, without any doubt, a completely engineered landscape. But what if they weren't the exception? What if they were just the most spectacular and well-preserved example of a process that was happening all across the Amazon basin? The evidence is overwhelming. Those geometric earthworks, the geoglyphs, they aren't unique to Bolivia. Hundreds have been found in the Brazilian state of Acre and elsewhere, hinting at widespread complex societies. And Terra Preta, the man-made supersoil? It's not just on the Kasarabe mounds. Patches of it, some very large, have been found throughout the Amazon, from the lowlands of Colombia to the mouth of the river in Brazil. This was a technology that was known and practiced by many different cultures, a shared heritage of sustainable soil management. But the most profound evidence of all is written in the trees themselves. For a long time, ecologists were puzzled by a phenomenon in the Amazon. While the forest is home to a staggering number of tree species, a huge percentage of the individual trees, some estimates say over half, come from just a couple hundred hyperdominant species. And the truly strange part is that a huge number of these hyperdominant species are incredibly useful to humans. We're talking about the Brazil nut tree, the cacao tree where chocolate comes from, the acai palm, and dozens of other fruit and nut-bearing species. It's a bit suspicious when a supposedly wild forest has a convenient overabundance of chocolate and nut trees. It's like finding a forest made entirely of pizza trees. You start to suspect it wasn't an accident. The theory is that this isn't a natural distribution. It's the result of millennia of ancient agroforestry. Pre-Columbian peoples didn't just clear-cut the forest for their fields, they managed it. They would clear the underbrush but leave the useful trees standing. They would actively plant the seeds of their favorite species in their gardens and along their travel routes. They were playing the long game. They weren't just planting for next year's harvest. They were planting for their great-great-great-grandchildren. Over thousands of years, this process fundamentally changed the very composition of the Amazon rainforest, turning it into a giant, dispersed orchard. An archaeologist can now look at the species of trees growing around an ancient settlement and can literally read the legacy of what the people who lived there ate and used. The central debate in Amazonian ecology today is no longer if humans shaped the landscape, but how much. Was the entire forest a deliberately cultivated parkland, or was it a natural forest that was just heavily influenced in certain areas? The truth is likely a mosaic of both, but the fundamental picture remains the same. The Amazon we see today is a cultural landscape, not a natural one. It is a legacy of the agricultural genius of indigenous Americans, the same genius that gave the world potatoes, maize, tomatoes, and vanilla through the Columbian exchange. We just failed to recognize that their genius wasn't limited to farm fields. It was applied to the entire forest. This completely flips our romanticized notion of what it means to be in harmony with nature. For these ancient Amazonians, it did not mean living lightly and leaving no trace. On the contrary, it meant leaving a massive, productive, and permanent trace. It meant actively participating in the ecosystem, enriching it, and managing it for long-term abundance. They didn't just adapt to the forest, they made the forest adapt to them. They proved that it is possible for a large human population to not only live in a tropical ecosystem, but to actually increase its productivity and biodiversity. They weren't just living in a Garden of Eden, they were its gardeners. And this ancient, abandoned garden might just hold some crucial secrets, some important lessons that we in our modern world desperately need to relearn. So you are standing in the middle of this ghost of a garden, this testament to a lost world of sustainable ingenuity. It's fascinating as a piece of history, a profound archaeological puzzle. But is it just that? A curiosity from the past? Or does this ancient abandoned garden hold tangible lessons for us right here, in the turbulent 21st century? The answer is a resounding yes. The Kasarabe and their neighbors weren't just ancient peoples, they were practitioners of a form of sustainability so advanced, we are only just beginning to catch up. Lesson number 1, resilience through diversity. Let's look at our modern food system. It's a marvel of productivity, built on the principles of the Green Revolution in the mid-20th century, which gave us high-yield crops, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. But its great strength is also its great weakness. It is a system of monoculture. We plant vast, horizon-spanning fields of a single variety of corn, or wheat, or soy. These systems are incredibly efficient, but they are also incredibly fragile. A single new pest, a new disease, or a prolonged drought can cause a catastrophic failure. Our modern food system is a bit like a gambler betting their entire life savings on one horse. The Kasarabe, on the other hand, were smart enough to bet a little bit on every single horse in the race. Their system was a highly diverse polyculture. They had their aquaculture, providing a stable protein base. They had their mound agriculture with a mix of crops like maize, manioc, and squash. They had their agroforestry, the managed forest gardens. And they had hunting and gathering. If the fish harvest was poor one year, a strong maize crop might see them through. If a blight hit their squash, they could rely more on the fish. This diversity created a web of resilience that could absorb shocks and adapt to change. Lesson number 2, work with natural forces, not against them. Our modern approach to water management is often a story of brute force. We see a flooding river and we build massive concrete levees to contain it. We see a dry landscape, and we build a colossal dam to create a reservoir, often displacing communities and destroying ecosystems in the process. We try to dominate and control nature. The Kasarabe took a gentler, more intelligent approach. They didn't try to stop the annual flood. That would have been impossible and foolish. Instead, they accepted it as the central reality of their world and asked, how can we benefit from this? They subtly redirected the water's flow, they captured its bounty, and they used its energy to power their entire civilization. They managed a province-sized water system without a single PowerPoint presentation or budget meeting. Their infrastructure was made of local, biodegradable materials. It was a soft form of engineering, based on deep ecological knowledge rather than overwhelming force. As our own climate becomes more unstable, bringing more extreme floods and droughts, this principle of working with rather than against natural cycles is more relevant than ever. Lesson number 3, and perhaps the most important. There is no such thing as waste. Our modern linear economy is built on a model of take, make, dispose. We extract resources, manufacture products, and then throw them away into landfills. The Kasarabe lived in a circular economy. Their big secret was that the solution to their food problem was the leftovers from their last food problem. The charcoal from their fires, the bones from their fish, the broken pieces of their pottery, and their own organic refuse were not trash. They were the precious ingredients needed to create terra preta, the rich living soil that was the foundation of their long-term agricultural success. Today, as we grapple with overflowing landfills and the degradation of our planet's soils, this ancient wisdom is being rediscovered. The modern movements of regenerative agriculture and permaculture are based on this same principle, that by composting, using biochar, and recycling all organic matter, you can build, rather than deplete, the fertility of the soil. There are now scientists and gardeners all over the world experimenting with creating terra preta nova, new black earth, trying to reverse engineer this ancient technology to heal damaged landscapes. These aren't just quaint ideas from the past. They are proven long-term strategies for creating a stable and enduring human presence in a dynamic world. Of course, development economists and agronomists are actively debating how these ancient, low-tech and labor-intensive principles can be realistically scaled up to feed a global population of 8 billion people. We can't simply copy and paste the Kasarabe model. But the principles of diversity, of soft engineering, of a circular economy are timeless. They offer a powerful and inspiring alternative to the often destructive path we are on. And it raises a tantalizing question. If the lessons are written in the soil and the shape of the land, Does any of this knowledge still exist in the minds of the people who live there today? So what remains? The civilization collapsed, the cities were abandoned, and centuries of disruption followed. Is there anything left of this incredible body of knowledge, this deep, sustainable wisdom, among the people who call the Llanos de Moxos home today? The answer is complex, a story of both profound loss and incredible resilience. The people who live in this region today, like the Mojeno, the Baure, and other groups, are the direct descendants of the Casarabe. The land was never empty, but their history since 1400 CE has been one of immense upheaval. You cannot underestimate the trauma of the last 500 years. First came the diseases unknowingly carried by the first Europeans, which swept through the Americas, causing a demographic collapse of staggering proportions. Then, in the 17th century, came the Jesuits. The establishment of the famous Jesuit missions, while complex in their legacy, fundamentally restructured indigenous society. People from different groups were brought together and resettled into mission towns, and their traditional political structures and belief systems were suppressed in favor of Christian orthodoxy. After the Jesuits were expelled, the pressures of the modern world, from the rubber boom to the expansion of cattle ranching, continued this process of disruption. Expecting a perfect, unbroken oral tradition of how to build an urban center after centuries of this kind of turmoil is like asking someone today to explain, in detail, how to repair a VCR. The knowledge was once vital, but a few world-altering things have happened since then. And yet, the knowledge was not entirely extinguished. It survived in fragments, in practices, and in stories. It survived because much of it is simply the most intelligent way to live in this unique environment. You can see it today. Many indigenous communities and local ranchers still build their houses on the ancient lomas. This isn't necessarily because of a specific tradition telling them their ancestors did so, but because of a living, practical knowledge that it is the only sensible place to build if you want to stay dry. If your great-great-great-great-grandfather built a house on a hill to avoid getting his feet wet, you don't then go and build yours in a puddle. The specific knowledge of the giant fish weirs seems to have been lost, but the intimate understanding of the aquatic world that underpinned it has not. The fishermen of the Llanos de Moxos today possess a deep, inherited knowledge of the rivers and lakes, of the behavior of different fish species, and of the rhythms of the flood. This is ancestral science, passed down through practice from one generation to the next. The myths and oral traditions, too, hold a powerful echo of the past. The stories of the great ancestor who raised the causeways and controlled the waters are a form of history, a way of remembering the monumental achievements of the past, even if the technical details have faded. In recent years, something amazing has begun to happen. Modern archaeology is no longer just a one-way street, with scientists from the outside coming in to discover the past. There is a growing movement of collaborative archaeology, where researchers work in partnership with the descendant communities. Archaeologists bring the LiDAR maps, the satellite imagery, and the excavation data. They can show a village elder a LiDAR image of their territory, and suddenly the faint overgrown lines on the ground that they've known their whole lives resolve into a coherent, ancient city. The community, in turn, shares its own knowledge. They can tell the archaeologist that a certain mound has a name in their language, that it is associated with a specific story, or that a particular plant that grows there has a medicinal use. It turns out that the people whose families have lived in a place for 3,000 years might have some useful insights for the archaeologists who just showed up last Tuesday. This process is profoundly empowering. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon have been told that their ancestors were simple savages. Now, science is proving that their ancestors were some of the most sophisticated, sustainable engineers the world has ever seen. This knowledge is becoming a powerful tool for cultural revival. Community leaders are using the evidence of their deep historical roots and their ancestors' mastery of the land to strengthen their identity, to teach their children about their heritage, and even to support their legal claims to their ancestral territories. A sensitive and ongoing topic of discussion is how to ethically balance the goals of scientific research with the rights of these communities to be the primary stewards and interpreters of their own heritage. But when it works well, it's a beautiful synergy of science and tradition, both working together to bring the past to life. But this reunion with a lost heritage is happening at a precarious time. The ghost of the Kasarabe world, having survived centuries of neglect, now faces a new and perhaps even greater threat. The modern world, with its insatiable appetite for resources, is pushing into the Amazon faster than ever before, and the very forces that are helping to reveal this ancient landscape are also threatening to erase it for good. There is a profound and tragic irony at the heart of this story. We have, in just the last couple of decades, finally pulled back the curtain. With our incredible technology and a new willingness to shed old biases, we are at last beginning to see the Kasarabe and their world for what they were. A brilliant, sustainable civilization that holds vital lessons for our own future. And at this exact moment of revelation, this lost world is facing a second and this time final extinction. It's the ultimate tragic irony. We finally get the X-ray vision to see this lost world, just in time to watch it get run over by a bulldozer. The threats are not coming from a single malicious source. This isn't like the tragic, deliberate destruction of a monument like the Buddhas of Bamiyan in Afghanistan. The threats to the Llanos de Moxos are more insidious, driven by the relentless pressures of the modern global economy. The primary driver of destruction in the region is the expansion of agriculture, especially cattle ranching. The Llanos de Moxos is prime cattle country, and for generations ranchers have been altering the landscape for their herds. The constant trampling of thousands of hooves erodes the low, delicate earthen weirs and causeways. Sometimes, a rancher will simply bulldoze a mound, seeing it not as a priceless piece of human heritage, but as an inconvenient bump in their pasture land. Even more destructive is the arrival of large-scale, mechanized agriculture. As demand for commodities like soy grows, vast tracts of savanna are being plowed under. A plow is a death sentence for this kind of archaeology. It completely obliterates the subtle earthworks, churning the rich terra preta of the mounds and scattering the artifacts. A site that has survived for 1,500 years can be erased in a single afternoon. Protecting these sites is hard because a 2,000-year-old ceremonial causeway, to a guy on a tractor, just looks like a bump in the ground that needs to be flattened. Deforestation and fire add another layer of threat. The forested mounds, the ancient settlement sites, are ecological and archaeological islands. When the forest is cleared for timber or to expand pasture, the context of these sites is lost, and they become vulnerable to erosion. Ranchers often use fire to manage their pastures, and these fires can burn out of control, scorching the ground, damaging surface artifacts, and destroying the delicate ecological legacy of the ancient agroforesters. And as the region develops, new roads are cut through the landscape, slicing through ancient causeways, while growing towns and infrastructure sprawl out over previously untouched sites. Preserving this heritage is a monumental challenge. The first problem is its sheer scale. You can put a fence around a pyramid or a stone temple, but what do you do when the artifact is the entire landscape? When the archaeological site covers thousands of square miles? Putting up a "please don't bulldoze the ancient city" sign is a nice thought, but it's a bit inadequate when the city is bigger than your average national park. The second problem is the subtlety of the features. They are made of earth, often low to the ground and covered in vegetation. They don't scream ancient monument. They whisper, and it's very easy to drown out a whisper with the roar of a diesel engine. The most difficult challenge, however, is balancing preservation with the needs of the people who live there today. Conservationists and policymakers are in a constant struggle to find a balance between the legitimate needs for economic development in a relatively poor region of Bolivia and the urgent necessity of protecting this globally significant heritage. You cannot simply tell a struggling farmer that they cannot use their land because of some faint lines on the ground that an archaeologist finds interesting. The solution, if there is one, must involve the local communities. It must involve providing economic incentives for preservation, perhaps through sustainable tourism. It must involve working with ranchers to find ways to graze their cattle that minimize damage, something that has been humorously dubbed cow archaeology, in some instances, as the cows themselves sometimes reveal sites by congregating on the drier mounds. The Bolivian government, along with international partners and the local indigenous communities, are working to document and protect these sites. But it is a race against time. Every year, more of this irreplaceable record of human history is lost. We have only just found this book, this epic story written on the earth, and already pages are being torn out before we've even had a chance to read them. It lends a sense of urgency, and also a deep sense of privilege to our journey. We have been able to see this world, to understand it, at the very moment it risks disappearing. And so before we leave, let's take one last moment to simply be there, to stand within this ghost of a garden and contemplate the world they made. And so, your journey ends where it began, in the heart of the Llanos de Moxos. But you are no longer the disoriented visitor, lost in a green hell. You are standing with a new kind of sight. It is deep into the night. You've made your way from one of the great mounds out onto a causeway, a long, straight spine of earth that disappears into the darkness. The air is warm and thick, and the world is alive with the sounds of the night. The chirping of insects is a constant, shimmering wall of sound, punctuated by the deep, croaking chorus of frogs from the wetlands and the occasional startling cry of a nocturnal bird from a nearby forest island. The ground beneath your feet feels solid, ancient. This is not just a path. It is a monument. You think of the hands that built this, the baskets of earth, the generations of labor. This single causeway is a thread in a tapestry that covers a territory larger than many modern nations. It connected cities to villages, people to resources, the living to their sacred sites. It was an artery that pulsed with the life of a civilization. From here, they would have watched the world transform from a golden savanna to a silver sea and back again. From here, they would have set out to maintain the fish weirs that fed them, their feet treading a path kept safe from the water. You can almost hear the ghost of a sound, the deep resonant call of a conch shell trumpet, echoing across a plain of still water, signaling the start of a ceremony or the end of a harvest. You look up. Away from the glare of any modern city, the sky is an overwhelming spectacle. The Milky Way is a luminous, star-dusted river splashed across the darkness, so bright it seems almost close enough to touch. You can see the constellations of the southern hemisphere with a clarity that is almost shocking. And you know now that you are standing on a piece of a giant astronomical instrument. This very causeway, this line you are standing on, was likely designed to meet the sun at a sacred moment in its annual journey. The sky was not just a ceiling to these people, it was a script. They read the turning of the seasons in its movements. They saw their gods and myths in its patterns. They aligned their entire world, their cities, their roads, their lives, to its grand cosmic rhythm. They did not just live under this sky, they managed their relationship to it, weaving its order into the very fabric of the earth. You think of the cities, Kotoka and Landivar, silent now for over 600 years, their great mounds and plazas shrouded in trees. You think of the potters painting the jaguar and the anaconda onto their vessels, telling the stories of their world. You think of the farmers tending their crops in the rich, black earth they themselves had created. You are standing in the silent ruin of a world that was, in its own way, as grand as Rome, as ingenious as Egypt. It was a civilization that chose to build with earth and water rather than stone and mortar. And for that, its genius remained invisible for centuries. It's a profoundly humbling feeling to stand in the footprint of such a history, to feel the weight of its complexity, its long success, and its eventual, mysterious decline. You feel the deep silence left by the collapse, the quiet that descended upon these plains and has in many ways lasted to this day, and you are left to wonder, as scholars will always wonder, what it truly felt like to be one of them. To stand on this causeway on a solstice morning and feel that deep, reassuring connection between your world and the heavens. To know your place in a cosmos that was not separate from you, but was written into the landscape you called home. The breeze picks up, rustling the tall grasses on either side of the causeway. It feels like a whisper, a sigh from a past that is not truly dead, but is merely sleeping, waiting in the earth and the sky to be remembered. And as you stand there, under that immense and silent sky, the edges of the ancient world begin to soften. The sharp details of the causeway, the mounds, the canals, and the lives of the people who inhabited them, all start to blend into a single, seamless story that you now carry within you. The sounds of the nocturnal Amazonian life begin to fade, replaced by a much quieter and more familiar hum. Perhaps the sound of the fan in your own room, or the gentle stillness of your own quiet space. The journey is over, but the sense of wonder it instilled remains, a quiet ember glowing in the back of your mind. You can feel your awareness returning from that distant, watery past, back through the centuries, back to the here and now. The weight of the humid air lifts, and you are left only with the gentle weight of your own breathing, a slow and steady rhythm in the quiet of your evening. The great mystery of the Amazon is no longer a void on a map, but a space filled with human ingenuity, resilience, and a profound, enduring wisdom that now echoes softly within your own thoughts. There is nothing left to challenge you, nothing left to discover for tonight, only a peaceful descent into the comfort of your own surroundings, leaving the ghosts of that ancient garden to their long and quiet rest. All that is left is to let the story settle, to allow the vastness of that lost world to become a quiet and comforting presence as you prepare for your own peaceful sleep.